Good evening and a warm welcome to Tamil Heritage Trust's Indology Festival 2026. Indeed, we are extremely happy to have all our participants, students, scholars, researchers, and enthusiasts of art and history who have joined us from across India and around the world. Art is the signature of man, said Anand K. Kumaraswamy. Indeed, art carries the unmistakable imprint of the people and the cultures who created it. Yet it is equally true that some of the most remarkable traditions of art have emerged, not in isolation, but from encounters when ideas, techniques, and visual sensibilities have traveled across regions and found new expressions in unfamiliar territory. The periods from our Indian art history that exemplify this most vividly are the Sultanate and Mughal eras. These are the periods when artists, patrons, and craftsmen from diverse cultural backgrounds came together to create some of the richest and fantastic visual repositories that were not only unmistakably Indian but also enriched because of the influences from across Asia and far beyond. Our Indology festival this year is titled Caves, Courts and Beyond, Painting Traditions of India. Over 6 days, we are trying to explore the rich and diverse painting traditions of India. We began by looking at some of the oldest expressions in the form of rock-cut paintings found in central India, and then moved on to the Buddhist paintings of Ajanta caves, the temple murals of South India, the intimate traditions of manuscripts and painted folios, and then we looked at the regional painting styles yesterday. All this is done through 8 talks. One thing is that in each of these talks, not only was new light thrown on the rich and diverse painting tradition of India itself, but we also got to explore the social and cultural worlds from where these traditions emerged. Before we move on to the main program, I'd like to give you a brief introduction about Tamil Heritage Trust, which is our organization. A voluntary organization started by a group of like-minded people almost 16 years back. Tamil Heritage Trust functions on the explicit objective of understanding, appreciating, disseminating, and celebrating information related to India's rich history and heritage, not just for the benefit of those who are scholarly or academically inclined, but the average enthusiastic public as well. Towards this end, we conduct programs throughout the year. On the first Saturday of every month, we have our monthly Heritage Talk, which is our flagship event, which we have been conducting uninterrupted for almost 15 years now. Then we have the Indology Festival. We are on to the 7th year now. This is a week-long online event conducted in the month of June. Then in the month of December, we have a 2-day in-person event, which we conduct in Chennai and call it Oratory Concert. It is supposed to collaborate with the Margari Isai Kacheris of Chennai. Apart from this, we also conduct various one-day workshops called How to See a Museum, How to See a Temple, etc., where anybody can register and participate. On and off, we have special classroom sessions. We also have some specific programs meant for target audiences, like the school teachers of Tamil Nadu or people who want to be trained as docents, etc. Apart from all this, we have also instituted 2 awards for individual contributions. The first such award is named after our co-founder and called Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award. This is given for individual contributions in the fields of Indian history and heritage. The second award is named after V. Venkaiah, who was the first official Indian epigraphist and is instituted by his great-granddaughter, Miss Sunita Madhavan. THT has been entrusted with the responsibility of administering this award, which is given for individual contributions in the fields of Indian epigraphy. We will soon be putting out flyers inviting nominations for the year 2026 for both these awards. We have a YouTube channel. You can find links to all our past talks here, right down to today's talk. Kindly subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications. Our social media handles, our mailing ID. You can mail us here to join our mailing list. Also, if you want to be part of any of our initiatives in a voluntary capacity, you can mail us here. We are a voluntary organization. We don't have any dedicated financial backing. So any kind of contributions are welcome. You may use this QR code or ID to contribute, and the same will be appreciated. Moving on to day 5, the theme for today is Sultanate and Mughal aesthetics. The Sultanate and Mughal periods witnessed extraordinary artistic innovation and cultural exchange. New courts and new patrons fostered artistic traditions that drew upon multiple influences while developing distinctive local identities. The paintings produced during this period reflect not only refinement and technical excellence, but also the cosmopolitan spirit of an age in which ideas, people, and artistic practices moved across regions and cultures. This evening, we have 2 fascinating lectures that will explore these artistic worlds through the paintings, patrons, and artists who helped shape them. Moving on to the first talk today, it is delivered by Dr. Deborah Hutton and titled The Many Delights of Deccan Painting. The painting traditions of the Deccan occupy a distinctive place in the history of Indian art. Known for their vibrant colors, imaginative compositions, and remarkable cultural diversity, they emerged in courts that were deeply connected to both the Indian subcontinent and the wider world. Through manuscripts and album paintings, these works offer valuable insights into the questions of patronage, identity, mobility, and artistic exchange. We will be guided through this fascinating subject by Professor Deborah Hutton. Dr. Hutton teaches art history at the College of New Jersey and is a leading scholar of the art and culture of the Deccan courts. Her research focuses on the artistic traditions of South Asia between the 16th and early 20th centuries, and she is the author of several important publications, including the award-winning Art of the Court of Bijapur. Beyond her specialist work on the Deccan, she has also contributed significantly to the teaching of global art history through a number of widely used textbooks that seek to broaden and diversify the field. Professor Hutton is widely recognized for bringing the art of the Deccan into larger conversations about global culture, mobility, and artistic exchange. A very warm welcome to you, Deborah. I now request you to take over the screen and deliver your lecture.
Thank you so much, Gauri. I have to say, I am incredibly impressed with the Tamil Heritage Trust. The dedication and intellectual curiosity and all of the things that you do are truly inspirational. So it's an honor for me to be part of this wonderful series. Thank you. And as the introduction suggested and the title of my talk suggests, today I will talk about the many delights of Deccan painting. And I'm now going to try to share my screen. So please bear with me for just a second. All right, everyone can see that okay?
Yeah.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. So to begin, we should address the question of what are we typically referring to when we say Deccan painting? What is included in this category? So, of course, as many of you know, geologically, the Deccan refers to the plateau that connects northern and southern India that's bordered on one side by the Western Ghats and the other side by the Eastern Ghats. If we were talking about Deccan art more broadly, we might be talking about art made in the region of this plateau from the beginning periods onward. However, when we say Deccan painting specifically, we meaning art historians, are referring to something more specific. We are referring to the art made in the 5 successor states, the 5 Deccan sultanates that succeeded the Bahmani dynasty, which had ruled the region in the 14th through 16th century. And so we are referring to these 5 sultanates that emerge in the 16th century. And here on this map on the right, you can see the 5 sultanates in the area in pink as they existed in the 16th century. Now, it's actually even more specific than that, because we only have paintings that survive from 3 of the 5 sultanates. And here I'm showing you a map on the lower left, showing the Deccan in the 17th century. And by that point, the Sultanate of Behrad no longer existed. Bidr, which you see here in the middle, did still exist. And you might be familiar with Bidri ware, the beautiful metalwork that was founded there. There's also architecture that survives, but to date, we haven't identified any paintings from Bidr. So when we're talking about Deccani painting during the Sultanate period, we're talking about 3 sultanates. First, Ahmednagar, which is the northernmost of the sultanates that was ruled by the Nizam Shahi dynasty from 1490 until 1636. And we have paintings that survive from about 1550 until the dynasty fell to the invading Mughal armies, and they were the first of the sultanates to fall. Second, and the westernmost of the sultanates, was Bijapur, ruled by the Adil Shahi dynasty, and they existed from 1490 until 1686. And here again, I'm showing you 3 examples. And what I'm doing now is I just want to give you a flavor of what the paintings from these various sultanates and periods are like. If you have specific questions about any of the paintings that I'm showing you now, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. I will say that for Bijapur, we have paintings that survive from about 1570 until right before they fell to the Mughals in 1686. And the painting here that you see most on the right is commonly called the House of Bijapur, and it's one of the last paintings believed to have been made at the court before it fell to the Mughals. The third is the Sultanate of Golconda, which is the easternmost of the sultanates, and this was ruled by the Qutb Shahi dynasty from 1518 until 1687. And again, we have paintings that survive from Golconda from about the 1570s until they fell to the Mughals, and they were the last of the sultanates to fall. The category of Deccan painting also includes paintings made for the Mughals when the Deccan was under Mughal rule, the period between 1636 and 1724. For part of this period, Aurangabad, the city of Aurangabad, seems to have been a center for painting. It also includes paintings made post-1724 when the Mughal Empire splintered and local regional powers came into the fore. This included the Nizam of Hyderabad, the Asaf Jahis, and Hyderabad state, as you may know, existed until India received its independence in the 20th century. However, when we're talking about Deccan painting, we typically stop in the 19th century when styles and mediums changed. So I should say for a second here, and what I'm showing you here are 2 examples of 18th century painting from Hyderabad. And I should say, when I say painting in terms of medium, there are a few examples of wall painting, and I will show you one later on. But for the most part, what we're talking about are works on paper that were made to illustrate manuscripts or to illustrate albums or to be viewed on their own. Okay, so in sum, what we're talking about when we say Deccan painting is about 300 years of painting from the mid-16th to the mid-19th century in the Deccan Plateau, broadly defined, as it existed under a variety of political entities. And so anything I say about this period is going to have exceptions. It's not going to cover all of the art that was created. That said, I do think that there are 4 characteristics that are really important to understand if you want to learn about Deccan painting, and that will bring to the fore the many delights of studying Deccan painting. The first of these is that Deccan painting is a product of a cosmopolitan courtly cultures shaped by the mobility of people, objects, and ideas. Second is that Deccan painting engages with a diversity of visual, linguistic, and let me pause here for 1 second. I want to point out that linguists consider the Deccan to be what they call a linguistic splinter zone. And this is where various language regions come together. So if we were to map the Deccan on this map over here, you would see that we have these language groups coming together. And so in the period we're talking about, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Marathi, Telugu, Kannada, Farsi, and Dakhini were all spoken in the Deccan. Dakhini, also sometimes called Deccani Urdu, was actually being developed during this period. And the exact sort of ratio of how many people spoke which language would have shifted as you moved from one part of the Deccan to another. Okay, back to my characteristics. So the second, again, engages with a diversity of visual, linguistic, and religious traditions, including especially esoteric religious practices. And here I'm showing you an example of that on the right. I'm just going to close my blind a little bit. It's morning here and the sun is coming out in New Jersey. Okay. So I'm showing you an example, one example of this on the right, a painting from early 17th century. Bijapur, where you can see, here we have a yogi, a Hindu ascetic, being visited by a yogini. He's sitting on his animal skin carpet with lions in the foreground. There's that esoteric religious practices. But then in the background, we have this scene of palaces with Persianate figures and an elephant fight going on. And so you have this coming together of diversity of traditions. Third, many, not all, but many of the paintings from the Deccan are marked by innovation and experimentation. And I'll again get more into that in a minute. Finally, there is much we currently don't know about Deccan painting. This last one isn't always delightful. It can be frustrating, but it's nonetheless important to note. So what I'd like to do now is to further explore these points through some case studies, primarily focusing on art from Bijapur because that's the Sultanate I know best, and it's also the one that has received the most attention to date, but I will also focus on examples from some other parts of the Deccan as well. And because I am a teacher through and through, I've been teaching undergraduate students in the United States for 2.5 decades at this point. I'd like to shift gears a bit for you now. Now that I've set the stage, I've shown some maps, I've given you background information, I'd like to do what I call a close looking exercise as a way to get us to put aside whatever else we're thinking about and really fully engage with the artworks. So if we were in person, I would ask you now to pull out a piece of paper and spend 3 to 4 minutes looking closely at this painting and write down what you see and how you were reacting to what you see. What do you notice? What questions arise for you? And then at the end of our 3 or 4 minutes, I would ask you to share with me some of the things that you noticed. Because we are on YouTube, which, amazing that I'm sitting here in New Jersey talking to you all. In India, I will never not be amazed by that. But because of that, I'm going to try to walk through what I imagine you might be noticing about this artwork. So your first reaction might be that it looks strikingly different than the various Deccani paintings that I just showed to you, or the Indian paintings with which you're familiar. The subject matter is stark, an incredibly emaciated man riding an equally emaciated horse. The man's rib cage is visible, and he weakly holds a small riding crop in one hand and the horse's reins in the other. But the nag seems barely able to go anywhere with his head lowered and his tail tucked between his legs. He is so thin that the man's ankles, as you see here, his feet are able to cross under the horse's belly, a physically impossible but nonetheless evocative detail. Visually, aesthetically, it's also stark. The background is blank, and the artist has painstakingly rendered the man in only charcoal, so that we cannot help but take in his wispy, thinning hair, his gaunt limbs, hunched back, and drooping loincloth. The horse, on the other hand, seems almost ethereal despite its pitiful state. Looking more closely, you may have noticed this is because the nag's body is composed of a marbled pattern, a decorative pattern composed of dancing waves of bright red, maroon, dark blue, and mossy green, which is delicately outlined in gold, and the artist added more gold to pick out the horse's eyes, his scant mane, and his protruding ribs. In so many ways, the image combines naturalistic elements with exaggerations and abstraction. Taking it all in, you might now be wondering what is going on. What does the subject matter signify? And why was the horse's body composed of a marbled pattern rather than drawn like the rider? Moreover, you might be asking, how did the artist do it? How did the artist keep the marbled pattern so precisely to just the horse's body? The eagle-eyed among you might have noticed that the painting was cut down at some point and pasted on another piece of paper, clipping a bit of the horse's tail, and that there is no inscription or artist signature visible on the page. And so you might be wondering about the history of this work. Who made it? When was it made? Where was it made? And is there anything else like it? Well, let me introduce a second work to our close looking exercise. Immediately, I'm sure you all recognize the subject matter. It's our emaciated horse and rider again, although this rider has a slightly different face, suggesting it was drawn perhaps by a different artist. But now the horse is also drawn, and the marbled pattern is in the background. And it's a bold, dynamic pattern that interacts with the image in fascinating ways. Notice here this dark swirl that comes up and swirls around to cross behind the nag's upraised front leg, or this dark diagonal section that mirrors the man's outstretched arm. The effect is dizzying, and the image may be like anything you've ever seen before, and yet seem oddly familiar. If it seems familiar, it may be that the man recalls Mughal and Persian paintings of Majnun, like the example you see here on the right. So Majnun is a character from Persian poetry, specifically the tale of Layla and Majnun, in which, as children, Majnun falls madly in love with Layla, and his love becomes almost an obsession and leads him to madness. Majnun literally means crazy. When her father marries her off to someone else, Majnun retreats to the desert and disconnects from the physical world, becoming incredibly emaciated and eventually dying. And you can see, I think, here how he has the same broad shoulders, rib cage, incredibly long, gaunt arms and legs, and loincloth that is falling off that our rider does. So the tale of Layla and Majnun is often seen as a Sufic Islamic mystical metaphor for the search of union with God, and that the searcher must give up all status in the world, all material, physical connections in order for that union to be achieved. And so that suggests that perhaps there's some sort of Sufi metaphor with this imagery. Or perhaps for you, the combined skeletal horse and figure remind you of similar imagery found in many cultures of the world. Here I'm showing you a drawing by Albrecht Dürer of death riding that was made in 1505 in Germany. Or perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps there are other things that you're familiar with that bring up connections for this painting. In any case, we don't know what the original artists were thinking or where they took their inspiration from, because the fact is, we don't know who the artists were or even precisely when or where these artworks were made. Scholars generally agree that they were created during the 17th century, most likely mid-17th century in the Deccan, most likely in Bijapur. And the reasons for this have to, in part, to do with the history of marbling, as well as the likely technique used to make the images, these marbled drawings that we've been talking about. It also has to do, by the way, with how the figures are drawn, elements in the drawing, but I would like to focus on the marbling technique and the history of marbling in the Deccan here. So for those of you who may not be familiar with marbling, it's a technique used to decorate paper, such as you see on the right, in which pigments are floated in water. And here you're seeing someone adding the pigments to the water. Typically, a substance is added to the water to make it viscose or heavy so that the pigments will float on the surface. And then the artist will use a series of implements, sometimes a comb-like implement, to comb patterns into the dyes. Sometimes they'll even blow through a straw to create the patterns. And then once the artist is happy with the pattern that they created, they will take a piece of paper and carefully place it on top of the water to pick up that pigment. It's a type of essentially mono printing. And then you leave that to dry. And it can be used for bookbinding or calligraphy. The example that you see here on the right, you can see that the artist combed a pattern in the marbling, and then at the very end added drops of pigment to create these sort of abstract, beautiful blotches. The history of marbling is unclear. The exact origins of the technique are debated, but we know that it was practiced in the Persian world by the 15th century during the Timurid dynasty, and that it had spread to India, both North India and the Deccan, by the 1580s. In Persian, the technique goes by several names, which you can see here. All of them contain the term abri, and so it's oftentimes just shortened to abri. Meaning,
Deborah, just 1 minute. Can you be a little louder?
yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is that
Not an
better?
issue. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Thank you.
Do you want me to repeat anything?
No, I think it's okay. Just our audience felt that your voice was a little muffled. So that's it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So marbling goes by several names in Persian, which I've listed here on the screen. All of them contain the term abri, which means translated as cloud-like or clouded. And what's important about this is that, for example, in English, it's called marbling, suggesting that we see it as an imitation of a hardened stone, something set. Whereas in Persian, it is seen as being like clouds or a clouded substance. In other words, as representing something shifting and ephemeral. An art historian named Jake Benson has done a lot of work on the history of abri in the Deccan, and what he has found is that at least one of the experts on this technique in the Deccan was an emigre from Iran who continued to develop the technique once he was in India. And in fact, he's the one who came up with the idea of adding these drops after the painting pattern was combed. And he sent examples of his marbling, his abri work, back to Iran, where they were praised for their innovation and boldness. Now, going back to our abri drawings from the Deccan, it's not the two that I've shown you, these emaciated horse and rider, are not the only ones that survive. There's a corpus of about 12 or so, maybe more, examples that date to the Deccan, 17th and 18th century. Scholars don't agree on exactly how they were made, and it's not even clear that they were all made the same way. But in general, they involved stencils and resist masking. So for example, here you're seeing an elephant trampling a horse, and the marbling is in the background. And I just want to point out for a second the composition of the horse and elephant, how they kind of are tumbling and turning, and how the artist has made the combing pattern in the marble follow the drawing to accentuate that tumbling pattern. So how this would have been made is that there probably would have been a stencil of the elephant and horse that was made. It was pasted onto the paper, and a mordant or resist, not a mordant, I'm sorry, a resist was added so that to keep that area from getting the marbled pattern. And so then when it was placed on the water, so to pick up that pattern, it was allowed to dry, the masking was removed, and the artist could then add the drawing and finally add the details of painting, such as the gold change on the elephant. Again, referring to Jake Benson's excellent work, he suggests, I think quite persuasively, that the reason why this innovative abri drawing technique was developed in the Deccan was because there was another artistic tradition that was flourishing in the Deccan at the time, which may have inspired the artists. And this is namely kalamkari cloth painting. So many of you may be familiar with kalamkari textiles. They are practiced in various parts of India, but they really flourished in the Deccan during this period. And this here, I'm showing you an example from 17th century Golconda. And if you know anything about kalamkari painting, you know that it was a multi-step process where the artist had applied resist to the areas that they did not want to have taken the dye, and they applied mordant to the areas where they did want the dye. They would then put the cloth in the dye, let it dry, wash it, let it dry, and then repeat the process, each step for all of the different layers of color. And so this may have inspired the abri drawings. Okay, so I just want to make sure, can everyone hear me okay now? Are we good?
Yes, you're fine.
All right, excellent, good, thank you. Okay, so what is striking about the abri drawings, at least for me, is that they demonstrate artists, many of whom were emigres from other places, but some who were local from the Deccan, combined an imported artistic technique, the abri, with local artistic practices, the resist, dyeing, to create something new. In other words, the artists were experimenting and innovating. And here again, I'm showing you a few more examples. The abri drawings included a range of subjects, as you see here, not all of them related to Sufism, though the figure at the left depicts a dervish, but all of them are showing off the artist's skill and their ability to innovate, to create something new. Returning now to the emaciated horse and riders, in these works, the experiment seems to go beyond just showing off the artistic expertise required to create the paintings, as impressive as that is. Rather, it also seems to be about taking a decorative technique and turning it into something that conveys a deeper meaning. As I alluded to earlier, the imagery of the emaciated man is often connected to Sufism through figures like Majnun. The emaciated horse can also be connected to Sufi thought, as it represents the base ego or lower self that needs to be controlled. So a horse was seen as a kind of old nag was seen as representing the base ego that one needs to control. The two figures together, so close to death, can be seen as representing the end stages of a Sufi's path, which included annihilation of the physical self and then union with the divine. So the cloud pattern on the horse almost seems to suggest the dissolving of the physical form of the base ego, while the cloud pattern in the background of the other image seems to capture the moment of transition from one stage to another. The artists, I would argue, were experimenting with ways to give visual form to unseen phenomena or belief. In other words, how do they depict in visual form an experience that one doesn't normally experience visually? And we can see this play out in another example from Bijapur. This time, the illustrations accompanying a Sufi romance called the Prem Name, meaning the laws of love or the rule of love, which was written by a poet named Hassan Manji Khalji and is datable between 1591 and 1604. The text, which I don't have any text pages here to show you, but the text is unique and written in an early form of Dakhni that seems to mix in a lot of Marathi words, as well as words from other local dialects, and has a sort of word play where they're just lines of one-syllable words, so it can be tricky to read. It's illustrated with 34 paintings that appear to be done by at least 3 different artists, and I'm showing you 3 of the paintings here. The artist identities are, of course, unknown. And the story follows what's called the Prem Marg, or Path of Love genre of Sufi literature, in which a love story is written in rhyming verses that mirrors the quest of a Sufi for union with God. So in this case, the lover, who you see here, is a prince named Shahji, who sees an image of his beloved and then goes off in search of her, and her name is Maji. So we have a prince and princess named Shahji and Maji as our 2 main characters. And the very first illustration, which is what you see here on the left, starts with Shahji listening to music played by a yogini, a female Hindu ascetic. He then goes off on search of his beloved, wandering through countrysides and encountering various ordeals before he finally finds her. And the last third of the manuscript describes their wedding preparations and wedding in great detail. And that's what you're seeing on the right, is one of the illustrations from the preparation of their wedding. Now, stylistically, these are pretty characteristic of Bijapuri art of the period. You have these very thick pigments. You have this use of gold for the sky, sometimes with this blue band above. And you have these very dark foliage and this use of kind of dark green, orange, gold, and lavender and pink. So it's very kind of typical. And people have often talked about this manuscript as being important in the development of Bijapuri painting. But what is unique about these illustrations, and to me, what is will never not be utterly charming, is that in every single illustration of Shahji, his beloved's face is depicted on his chest as if radiating from his heart. And so hopefully you can see it in these, but just in case, here's a detail of the first illustration, and you can see his hand is actually touching, just about touching her face in this image. And I have not encountered this type of visual device in any other manuscript. Perhaps it does exist somewhere, but I haven't seen it. And it's actually relaying an important part of the written text. That is the idea that her image resides inside of him, right? This idea. Because in the story, when he finally finds Maji, when he finally reaches the palace where she lives, rather than being happy, he is conflicted because he has come to see the image of her that he carries in his heart as reality, and the Maji before him as a mere reflection. So he's forced to go off and contemplate things to kind of get his head on straight. And meanwhile, Maji, who is also in love with him, is then left to go through a period of longing and lament covering the 12 months of the Hindu calendar. And so what you're seeing on the illustration on the right is from that 12-month period of lament. In this illustration, she and her companions are in a garden. The companions are celebrating Holi. while she sits longing for Shaji. And in another unique detail, her longing for Shaji is so intense that she's depicted as literally having flames emanate from her body that you might be able to see. And I love that one female companion seems to be trying to helpfully pour water over her to cool her off. Again, what we see in this manuscript is an original work, an innovative work related to mystical traditions that combines diverse linguistic, cultural, and religious elements, and notably shows artists experimenting with ways to put unseen emotions, concepts, and literary metaphors into visual form. Now, there's much we don't know about this manuscript and its artist. For example, all the paintings aren't made on the paper. They're made on separate sheets of paper and then pasted on. So we don't know for sure that they were all made at the same time. We also don't know who the artists are, and we don't know what the role that this yogini plays in the very first image. Is it Maji disguised as a yogini, or is it some other figure? Her identity isn't readily apparent in the text, although a full translation of the text has yet to be done because, like I said, it's quite difficult language. Moreover, what was the relationship between the Pem names, illustration of the yogini, and the many single-page paintings of yoginis attributed to early 17th century Bijapur, such as these two examples? The one in the middle, now housed in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, is probably one of the most famous Deccan paintings. You may have seen it before. It's graced the cover of several books. And for good reason, it's a remarkable painting. We have this yogini here, beautiful yogini bedecked in jewels, her dupattas flying outward, flanked between these oversized flowers that may have been inspired by Chinese painting, with this fantastical landscape behind her of craggy hills and white palace and golden sky. Was it done by the same artist who painted the Pame Names first illustration? Or was it based on that illustration? Certainly, there are many striking similarities between the two. The yogini's dress in both, for example, and their physical appearance, as well as the oversized flowers behind them, the craggy landscape, and the white palace in the distance. But there is just so much we don't know that it's impossible to make any definitive connections. And again, this can be frustrating at times. On the other hand, in the 20 years since I wrote my book on the art of the court of Bijapur, scholars much, much smarter than me have turned their attention to the Deccan, and they have discovered things that tell us about at least some of the artists, authors, and patrons behind many of the artworks. I've already mentioned Jake Benson's work, and let me give you another example here. And this is a manuscript called the Nujum al-Ulum, or Stars of Sciences, this is another original text written in Bijapur, this time in 1570, and it's written in Persian. And here I'm showing you the cover and 2 folios from the manuscript, which has, depending on how you count the illustrations, somewhere between 400 and over 800 illustrations in total. The text is on astrology and astral magic, and compiles information from a variety of Persian and Sanskrit sources. It's framed by the author as a guide to the mysteries of the unseen world, and it's clearly intended for the ruling elite. So, for example, this illustration that you see here on the right is showing the ideal 7-storied throne belonging to the Chakravartin, the universal ruler, as it's imagined in Buddhism and Hinduism. And so you can see here the ruler at the top, seated on a blue lotus. He's dressed like a Deccan sultan. He has a canopy over his head. Below him, on the next level, are his consorts. Below that, you see his subjects. And I particularly love that they seem to have a range of subjects, right? Villagers, courtiers, tribal people. Below that are his advisors, his noblemen. And then below that are the elephants and horses that make up his army. And then below that, we have these rows of heraldic lions. The throne is labeled below as a Sinhasan chakra, referencing the Simhasana or lion seat that's associated with the Buddha and Vishnu. So it's really a remarkable manuscript. Again, this illustration is unlike anything that survives anywhere else. The book was long assumed to have been made in Bijapur, in part because of Ibrahim Adil Shah II's seal that you see right here. But there was an odd note in the manuscript. There was a note that said the manuscript was bought by a nobleman at the order of Ibrahim Adil Shah II of Bijapur. And so that begs the question of, if it was made in Bijapur, why did it need to be bought to be added to the royal library? And so people really debated this. And again, the Persian, it's a weird manuscript. It's, again, unlike anything before, and very, very dense subject matter that make it difficult to read. However, a brilliant scholar named Emma Flatt, with mounds of patience, I have to say, has spent years studying this manuscript. And she found buried in the text describing the planet Zorha, or Venus. And here I'm showing you the depiction of the planet. And you can see here she's depicted like a goddess with 4 arms, one of which holds a book. So somewhere in this text, accompanying this illustration, there's a reference to the identity of the author that says that it is no other than Sultan Ali Adil Shah I of Bijapur, who was the ruler when this manuscript was made. And here I'm showing you a portrait of him. And so it says that he is the author. She also found 2 other references that corroborate this idea that he was the author of this text. Whether or not we should take that at face value is questionable. Emma herself posits that it might have been the 16th century equivalent of a celebrity ghostwriter, that someone else at court wrote it and gave Ali the credit. But what it does is it makes clear that this is from Bijapur and that it reflects the values of Ali's court. And it does fit what we know about him. He was known to visit both Muslim and Hindu ascetics and speak with them to assess their sincerity and power. He also loved books and reading and is said to have employed nearly 60 people, including calligraphers, gilders, bookbinders, and illuminators in his library, which was overseen by the Pandit Shesh Wahman, who was paid a generous salary. And the court artist had the task of creating the illustrations for this volume, many of which were new. And so again, they had creative license and they seem to be reflecting the culture around them. What you're seeing here is another planet, this time personified as a Deccan Sultanate ruler, carrying a book in his hand, perhaps Ali himself, surrounded by a retinue of men in a variety of dress, reflecting their backgrounds and what would have been most likely what really the Deccan armies looked like. One particularly intriguing section of the book catalogs the various ruhanis, or spiritual beings. The text calls them ruhanis. What they really are yoginis, but not female Hindu ascetics like the yoginis I referenced earlier, but rather yoginis meaning divine goddesses, often associated with tantric and Shakta forms of Hinduism. By the time of the Najum's production, these yoginis or ruhanis were associated with specific locations and specific units of time related to the movement of the moon and stars. So the text goes through, and by the way, the chapter says it's going to talk about 84 ruhanis. It actually talks about 140, which is the most complete among the most complete accounts of yoginis that exist in any language. And so for each one, what it does is it describes their appearance, and then it describes the appropriate chakra or diagram that you should draw, and then what else you should do to harness their power. So basically to ensure victory in battle. And so for each one, this text that describes their appearance is accompanied by an illustration. They are shown everywhere from nursing mothers to kind of violent creatures. And they're also accompanied by that diagram, by that chakra, telling you how to invoke them properly. Now, Emma makes it clear in her analysis of the manuscript that there's no philosophical discussion of these esoteric powers. They're not presented as foreign. It's just a very practical guide, synthesizing information that, right, this is what they are, this is how you invoke these powers, with the idea that this would be used for a select group of powerful men to help the Sultan ensure Bijapur's victory. And so this is, for me, is really interesting because it starts to get at some of the reasons why we have this cosmopolitan culture and this emphasis on esoteric practices, on putting the unseen into visual form, and the coming together of different traditions. All of this innovation and experimentation. It's not just that you have all of this mobility, people from different backgrounds coming together that creates a lot of synergy, although that is definitely true. And they're coming together in a region that was already a diverse place with this linguistic splinter zone and people from a variety of religious traditions. But there was also the reality that these sultanates were vulnerable. There were never-ending border disputes, battles, skirmishes. Nobles and military men were constantly moving from one sultanate to another in search of better positions. The Portuguese were in Goa, creating problems. The Mughals were pressing southward. And so there's a real necessity to find new knowledge, in the case of the Najum, for example, but also to create courtly cultures that are going to bind people together, that will allow people, newcomers, to demonstrate their loyalty to the ruler, while also giving the ruler a way to express their power and charisma. And a great example of this is the culture of Nouras that surrounded Ali's successor, Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who ruled Bijapur from 1580 until 1627. Ibrahim is often framed as a romantic figure, and in many ways he was. He was a follower of Sufism. He was a musician, and here you see a portrait of him in which he's playing music, wearing the dried beads of a Hindu mystic. He was also a poet, including supposedly writing a book of poems called the Kitab-i-Nouras in Deccan. I say supposedly because this might be another case of the celebrity ghostwriter phenomenon where someone else actually wrote it, but Ibrahim got the credit. But in any case, it's going to reflect his values. In any case, in these poems, he gives himself the Sanskrit title of Jagat Guru, a world teacher. He muses that his parents were the Hindu goddess Saraswati and the god Ganesh. And here we're seeing a remarkable painting of Saraswati from Bijapur. You can see her seated on this golden throne in a palace-like setting. There's a fountain at the bottom, this peacock, a blue and white Chinese vases flanking her thrones, an attendant. And then on either side, we have these angels who hold a canopy over her head. And nestled between the angel's blue wings is a painting that is another portrait of Ibrahim Adil Shah II on his favorite on his favorite elephant, sorry. So Ibrahim is an amazing figure, but he's much more than just an individual figure. He is also a product of the larger cosmopolitan Deccan culture that privileged engagement with a variety of traditions, benefited from the movement of people, and encouraged innovation. So, for example, this term Noras, from the Kitabi Noras, is a great example of this. It was a poetic term whose appeal rested in the fact that it could mean different things depending on how you pronounce the first syllable, no or nu. So it could mean either 9, in which case Noras would mean the 9 rasas or the 9 moods of Indian aesthetics, or it could mean Noras as in new, freshly arrived, which is a Persian term, or even Nowruz, referring to the Persian New Year. The term quickly took on a life of its own. It became a signifier of the courtly culture of the period, and you could show your belonging to that culture by participating in it. The scholar Nazar Ahmed has identified 17 different items named Noras, including a sweet wine, a new holiday, Eid Noras, celebrated whenever a Friday fell on the 9th day of the month, and even Ibrahim's new capital city, Noraspur. We also know of at least 2 artists who came to Bijapur from other locations during Ibrahim's reign, again underscoring the characteristics of mobility, diversity, cosmopolitanism, and the appreciation for newness. The first artist I want to discuss is Farrukh Beg, and I just realized that Yael Rice is going to talk about the lives of Mughal painters, so I hope that she doesn't contradict anything that I'm saying now, or I hope, or maybe she does. That would be great too. But Farrukh Beg, who was known in the Deccan as Farrukh Hussain, and I'll talk more about that in a second, who lived from about 1545 until 1619. And here on the left, you're seeing a self-portrait of Farrukh Beg made a few years before his death. I want you to notice and remember here these Deccan-y type flowers in the background. Well, we know that Farrukh Beg was born in Iran and began his career in around 1580 in Kabul. And here we're seeing an image attributed to him from the early 1580s that's very much done in a Persian style based on the colors and the flatness but detailedness of this architecture. His skill allowed him to quickly move to the imperial Mughal workshops in Lahore and Delhi, where he became a painter for the Mughal Emperor Akbar. And here you're seeing an illustration that he made for the Akbar Nama. And I want you to note here how the colors have slightly changed from the last painting and the architecture has more depth, showing that he's starting to bring in Mughal elements to his painting. Sometime between 1590 and 1595, and this is all still unknown, he seems to have moved to Bijapur and worked for Ibrahim Adil Shah II for about a decade before returning to the Mughal court around 1605 and working for the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And here at right, I'm showing you a portrait of Ibrahim created sometime between 1590 and 95 and signed, which you can't see because it's where my little image is on the screen, signed Farrukh with something else after it that we can't quite read. Here are 3 more works that are attributed to Farrukh Beg, 2 of them actually signed by Farrukh Hussain, and you've seen them earlier. This one here is actually the larger version of similar to what is shown here above the goddess Saraswati. Now, Farrukh Hussain is an artist that's listed in Bijapur's chronicles as being one of the jewels of Ibrahim's court and a very celebrated artist. So we know that an artist named Farrukh Hussain was at court. We have works that are signed by him and others that we can attribute to him based on style. The question that scholars debated was whether Farrukh Beg and Farrukh Hussain are the same person. And the reason why they questioned it was because if you look at the paintings, and here I'm showing you 2 examples from the 1590s, they're strikingly different in style. So is this the same artist? Recently, the art historian Keelan Overton has worked on this, and I think she is very persuasively shown, it will never be conclusive, but she's very persuasively shown that it is absolutely most likely the same artist, and that what we're seeing here is actually an artist shift their style to fit in the prevailing courtly culture of where they were working. And reminds us, and I think this is a really important thing that we always need to be reminded of, that style is not merely intrinsic to an artist, rather it's a result of their training, exposure, and conscious choice. Indeed, part of Farrukh Beg's talent was that his ability to produce art, which by being at the forefront of a particular culture in which he was working, pleased his patrons. And so in the case of Bijapur, he understood the importance of participating in the culture of Noras and adhering to the aesthetic styles that were in vogue at that court. His career highlights not only the movement of artists during this period, but also the metamorphoses in style that occur as artists encounter new imagery, ideas, and patrons, and how they shifted their styles to suit their patrons while still building a distinctive artistic approach. And we can see this in one final painting by Farrukh Beg, made at the end of his life when he was back at the Mughal court, in which he smoothly combines aspects of a European print. So here you're seeing this European personification of melancholy, that he's done here, with aspects of Mughal painting, the use of color, for example, but also aspects of Deccan painting, which I think you can most see in the fantastic foliage in this tree. So, okay, how am I doing on time? All right, I think I'm doing okay. The second artist that we know arrived in Bijapur during Ibrahim's reign is a Dutch artist named Cornelis Clauza Heda, who was born around 1566 and died in 1622. Now, Cornelis Clauza Heda, or Heda for short, was born in Haarlem and trained in what is called the Dutch Mannerist style. And here I'm showing you a painting by his teacher, Cornelis van Haarlem, that is very typical of this kind of Mannerist painting. You see mythological subjects, complex compositions, elongated and exaggerated, attenuated figures in contorted poses. Now, unfortunately, no paintings by Heda survive, but what we do have is often, in many respects, more valuable. We have a series of letters he wrote between 1610 and 1619 from Bijapur to the Dutch East India Company. And in them, he details his long, unexpected journey, ending up in Bijapur in 1610, where he finds employment with Ibrahim Adil Shah II and where he spends the most of his life. And I have to say that his story of how he ended up there is probably one of the most amazing stories that highlights the mobility of people during the early modern period, this period more broadly, not just in the Deccan. So basically, to sum up his story, he was born in the Netherlands, but for reasons he doesn't specify, he leaves and goes to seek patronage at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. Most likely, it's because tastes were changing in Haarlem and his type of painting was no longer in vogue and he couldn't make a living. So he goes to Prague to seek work with the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. Doesn't seem to have had much success there, but while he's there, a Safavid envoy, a group of ambassadors from Iran sent by Shah Abbas, come to Prague and they invite him to come be a court artist for Shah Abbas. So he sets off with them. They first try to go through the Russian way, but because of conflicts in the Tsardom of Muscovy of Russia, they cannot go. So they have to go back. They stay in Sweden for some time and finally make their way down to Belgium and then down to Portugal, to Lisbon, where he and the Safavid delegation managed to get passage on a ship headed to Goa. So it was the ship bringing the new Portuguese viceroy to Goa. And so he's on that ship, and the ship has to go around the Cape of Africa and winters in Portuguese Mozambique. While at some point in the winter, the viceroy comes to suspect that Haida is a spy for the Dutch, because the Dutch and Portuguese are fighting at this point. So he kind of imprisons Haida, does not let him get off to travel to Isfahan with the rest of the delegation, and instead takes him to Goa, where he's imprisoned. He manages to get released from prison in Goa on the word of a Flemish jeweler who says, no, he's not a spy. And in fact, the viceroy then actually offers him to be an artist in Goa for the viceroy. But Haida wants no part of this. And instead, he's hearing from all of these European jewelers that are traveling around the Deccan that Ibrahim Adil Shah is an excellent patron, and it's his court where you want to go. So he travels inward, ends up at Ibrahim's court, and right away gets an audience with the Sultan. And he actually describes all of this in detail in his letters. And he describes the first meeting with Ibrahim in some detail. And I want to just read a portion of that for you now. The king, meaning Ibrahim, the king, as a great lover of our art, has already had the news that I had come, and let me, since I arrived by horse, immediately come before him. Asking what sort of man I was, I gave him a description of all that had occurred. The king said that he had long wished for a painter from our land. He clothed me with great honor, following the custom of the land. The king commanded me to make something. The king's highest counselor and secretary took me with him to his palace. I did my best so that in 15 days I had a small piece of Bacchus, Venus, and Cupid, which the king also approved and held for 2 hours before his face. Meanwhile, speaking with me, and asked me if I wanted to serve him for a time, promising to give me great wishes. I swore him service, he showed me great honor, and further gave me a robe with a purse of 500 pagodas of money, ordered me to make another work, and in this work a great fever has surprised me, and now with God's help is going even better. So what he's describing is a painting, Venus, Bacchus, and Cupid, that was a pretty typical subject matter for Dutch Mannerist painting. And here I'm showing you another example, because Haida's version of it does not survive. It's a grouping of classical gods and goddesses that played on the ancient saying that without Bacchus and Cupid, Venus freezes, which was meant to reflect on the origins of love. And so Haida's painting probably looks something like this. It's also significant to note that he writes all his letters from Noraspur, Ibrahim's new capital, that was the culture of Noras, this new fresh flavors. So what's interesting is that Haida doesn't seem to have done that much painting for the rest of his time in Bijapur. He kind of served as an unofficial ambassador for the Dutch East India Company, and as a sort of spectacle, as sort of a living embodiment of the cosmopolitan and newness of exoticness that was favored at court. Now, we do, though, have a few paintings that survive from Bijapur that I would like to think maybe show some Mannerist influence on the painting. One is a work that you see at left, a miniature painting where if you look closely, you can see in the women's elongated arms, their elongated bodies and faces, the exaggerated gestures, some influence of Mannerist painting. More intriguingly, there's a wall painting, and here's my one example of wall painting, in the Asad Mahal in Bijapur that was done in 1646. It's heavily damaged, but I think if you look closely, you can see some interesting similar elements, the elongated arms, the body of the baby, the gesturing. It was early visitors to it assumed it was done by a European artist because of the women's faces that you see over here, but just perhaps, maybe, it was done by Indian artists trained by a Mannerist painter. But again, we don't know. Okay, so thus far in my talk, I have focused primarily on Bijapur, but these features that I'm discussing can be found in the other sultanates and in the later period of the Nizam of Hyderabad period. And so, for example, Europeans, and the Dutch more specifically, were traveling throughout the Deccan, and these Europeans contributed to Deccan visual culture through their patronage of paintings by local artists, by importing and exporting paintings, prints, books, textiles, as well as art supplies. And so here's an example of patronage. This is a painting of Cornelius van den Bogart, who was the Dutch East India Company's chief agent for Hyderabad. And you see him here depicted as a local nobleman would be, apart from his European dress, right? So he's in this European dress, but he's seated on the floor against these bolster pillows with his attendant holding a fly whisk over his head. He holds a mango in one hand, which was similar to what a lot of local rulers would do. And he sits facing these three men who have come to see him. And they sit under this beautiful printed cotton canopy. I have to say, I'm particularly intrigued by his attendant here, who seems to be an Indian, who is dressed in European dress and wearing what looks like either a wig or has a European haircut. And in one hand, he holds that fly whisk, but on the other, he's holding this branch of fruit, which scholars have said is meant to give a clue to Bogart's identity because his last name means orchard. Likewise, one of the distinguishing features of this period in Deccan history is the prominent role that East Africans, primarily from present-day Ethiopia, played in society, including as patrons of the arts. Referred to as Habshis or Sidis, they were brought over as enslaved soldiers, but in contrast to other parts of the world, such as the Americas, in the Deccan, some enslaved men from Africa rose through the ranks to assume powerful positions in society. And that's exemplified by these three portraits. We see Ikhlas Khan from Bijapur on the left, Malik Ambar from Ahmednagar in the middle, and Farooq Khan from Golconda on the right. They were powerful men who had many portraits of themselves painted. So we know they influenced the arts on the Deccan, but their influence has yet to be fully explored. And so that's another area where more work needs to be done. And it wasn't just men who were mobile or who influenced Deccan painting. Emma Flatt has a great line where she says that people moved between the sultanates for reasons that were both marital as well as martial. So for example, we know that Chand Bibi, the Ahmednagar princess who lived from about 1550 to 1600, moved to Bijapur in 1564 to marry Ali Adil Shah I, our author of the Nujum al-Ulum, and their marriage was to cement an alliance between the two sultanates. After his death in 1580, she served as regent to Ibrahim Adil Shah II for several years before returning to Ahmednagar in 1584. In 1595, she again rose to prominence, this time as the nominal ruler of Ahmednagar, who defended her sultanate, at least temporarily, against the advancing Mughal armies. And here I'm showing you a portrait of her on horseback with her attendants out in the countryside hawking that was made around 1700. Were there portraits of her made during her lifetime? Is this based on a portrait of her made during her lifetime? There may have been portraits of her. We know there were images of her mother, Kanza Humayun, who was the queen of Ahmednagar. When she moved back and forth between Bijapur and Ahmednagar, what paintings went with her? Did artists accompany her? Did she patronize paintings at either locations? These are all questions that we don't yet and may never have the answers to, but they are worth asking. Likewise, what manuscripts and paintings did other royal women patronize, purchase, read, or take with them when they moved from one sultanate to another? Here, we have a bit of a clue in a copy of the Gulshani Ishq, today housed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I'm showing you here on the right just one of the beautiful paintings from the manuscript. In this one, the male hero character is encountering fairies in this garden during his journey. So the Gulshani Ishq, or Rose Garden of Love, is another one of these Sufi romances that follows the Prem Marg format, where a lover sees his beloved, goes off in search of her, and then they finally end up together, and there's a wonderful wedding at the end. This one was written by Mullah Nusrati in 1657 in Bijapur. And it's very similar in plot to the same name, but this one has more fairies and supernatural figures. The story became immensely popular in the century after it was written. Multiple copies of it were made throughout the 18th century. So, for example, this one, which was made in Hyderabad and completed in 1742, contains 97 illustrations. The colophon, that is the end page that gives us information, provides this date of 1742 for completion of the manuscript and 743 for the completion of the illustrations. It also provides the name of the calligrapher and, notably, the name of the patron, who was a woman, Sajida Matram. We don't know anything else about her besides her name as of yet, but intriguingly, there's a note written on the inner cover of the manuscript in English that says that the book was taken from the Zinana of Tipu Sultan of Mysore by the British in 1799 at the siege of Seringapatam. Could the book have traveled with the bride from Hyderabad to Mysore, or been a gift between two women at the two different states? We don't know, at least not yet, but the illustrated manuscript certainly shows the continuation of the characteristics of Deccan painting that I identified earlier, including the point that there is so much more we need to figure out. And likewise, there's so much more I could say about Deccan painting, but I think I will leave it here so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. Thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Deborah. I think we are quite spellbound by the sheer range of Deccan paintings. We didn't know that there is so much and so much evolution in terms of style and everything. And really, I think we have a lot of information that we need to process. To moderate the question answer session, I invite Sai Vivek. Sai Vivek is an architect by profession and a heritage enthusiast by passion. Sai, I invite you to take over.
Thank you, Gauri. Thank you, Dr. Deborah. It is so fascinating that personally, we visited Bijapur twice. Once when we were studying architecture, and about 15 years later, once again, we made a visit to just refresh ourselves. But all we did was to look at the buildings, and we really didn't examine or even have an idea about the aspect of art in the Deccan. And this has opened a new chapter for us. Me and my wife, Jayashree, we both are architects, and it has opened a new chapter to explore. And when we were there, what we saw, or what we were very fascinated was by the Bidri ware, which is a fascinating craft, but with so much art in it. And we are very happy that it's still being made in the traditional way. And they've also been able to diversify into making mementos with a kind of modern perspective so that people accept it and not just use it the way it was. So coming back to what we heard from you today, the use of the marble texture. Now, that is something that is it invokes this question of how they were able to marry these two things together, which is painting and textures, and especially when there are two different kinds of mediums for the marble and for the painting. So how would they have done that?
Yeah. So we think, and again, there's not 100% agreement on this, but we think what they would have done was they would have started with a stencil. They would have done a drawing of what they wanted, and they would have made a stencil of it. And depending on if they wanted the marbling in the background or the marbling in the figure, they might use the stencil to mask the figure. So say, for example, in the Abri, emaciated horse and rider with the marblings in the background, they would have had a stencil of the horse and rider that they would have, so a paper cutout that they would have affixed to the paper and added resist to make sure that it couldn't seep under that, right? So you have to kind of apply it very carefully. And then they would have put the paper on the marbled, floated on the water, taken it off, let it dry, take off that stencil, and you would have the area where it was blank. So if you wanted, say, the horse to be marbled, then you would have to cover up everything else and just leave the horse to pick up the marbling. Vice
See,
versa.
that sounds easy, except that the beautiful way in which the marble pattern has been, merged or made part of the composition. So in the water, you have to get the pattern in that way and then put the stencil in such a way that the lines kind of converge where you want it to. Amazing technique, like really amazing. Like I would personally think that they must have wasted, I don't know, dozens of it before they got it right or something like that,
Agreed, because you have to pay. I mean, there's so many steps you have to do perfectly, right? You have to put.
Because in each and every one of them, the marbling was not just there. It was very clearly visualized the way where the lines and how the colors are supposed to go, whether in the background or foreground, and sort of enhance the whole painting with that technique. So
Right.
Amazing.
Exactly. And I didn't show you this, but there are ones where there are multiple different marbling techniques. So they did it more than one.
Multiple.
So there's some where, for example, a woman might have a marbling pattern on her body, and then there's another marbling pattern in the background. So it's amazing. But if you think about kalamkari textiles, it's the same thing. Like that must have been so painstaking to apply the mordant and the resist over these large textiles in so much detail, and to get it just right, and to have to do it multiple times and not mess up. And I think that it's very convincing that this specific marbling technique would develop in the Deccan, where kalamkari textiles were also being made. Makes a lot of sense to me, anyway.
So coming back to the marble effect, so Mr. Bhaskar from the audience has asked that there's an ankle lock around the emancipated horse, and that seems to be quite repetitive. So are there more examples of such art, or this is the only example that is available?
That's a great question. We have other images of the rider that are from the Deccan that are just drawings. They aren't marbled. And so it was clearly a theme that got repeated. And in every single one, his ankles are locked around the horse's belly, which, as I said, but I think is worth repeating, no matter how skinny a horse was, that's not actually physically possible to do. And so we have, one of the things that's striking about that drawing is that it is both so naturalistic in certain details, but clearly exaggerated and fantastical, not actually possible.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a lot of manuscripts of books, like the Nujum al-Ulam and the Kitab-e-Nawras. Yes. So are these manuscripts have these been translated just like the Babarnama was done, or are these still just in the Urdu language?
Dakhini, I think. They're all written in Dakhini?
The Kitab-e-Nawras is in Dakhini. Most of that has been translated. I don't think we have a recent translation, but it has been translated. The Nujum al-Ulum is in Persian, but it is, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. I studied Persian. I could not make head or tails of this manuscript.
Okay.
I Emma Flatt, the scholar that I mentioned, she must have the patience of a saint. She has studied that for so long because it has all of these concepts taken from a variety of traditions that are very difficult to understand, and it has a lot of it's talking about a planet, and it'll say like his favorite sweet is gulab jamun, and so you just don't. Your brain is going one way, and you don't expect the text to say that, and so it's very difficult to translate in that way. And so there's been no full translation of the Nizhar
Tell
model.
me, I mean, it seems such a technical or a scientific kind of text, no? Talking about astronomy and all. Are there other scientific texts across the world that have been illustrated like this? I mean,
Yes.
it's one thing to illustrate a poetry or that sort of a thing, but a scientific text to be illustrated like this,
Yeah, there is a long tradition in Arabic and Persian, in the Arabic and Persian speaking worlds, of these astrological treatises and treatises on magic, that how do you tap these things for power. But this one is different. It doesn't fit 100%. It has aspects of the astrology that those have, but in its, for example, its discussion of the throne of the Chakravartin or in the Yoginis, it's unlike any of those other manuscripts from the Arabic and Persian worlds. And so that's what makes it, I think, difficult to translate, but just fascinating to study.
And we've been exposed to the Mughal miniature paintings. And then
Yes.
we have spoken about you have spoken about the Deccan paintings of the Deccan today. So how do they differ? I know there is a lot of influence, or there have been people coming from the Mughal court to the Deccan, but is there a classification that will say that these are very different, or are they having a lot of similarities?
That's a great question. And this is the I always think I have an answer to this, like, yes, this is the difference. I can pinpoint the difference, and then I think, no, I'm completely wrong. That's not. And some of it is that one of the things, and I didn't have time to go into this, but Mughal influence comes into the Deccan even before the Mughals fully conquer. They're pressing down the sultanates have to make agreements with them, and you see, especially in portraiture, a Mughal influence. But then later on, you see a resurgence of a sort of Deccanese style. I would say that it varies from sultanate to sultanate. So each of the sultanates has a little bit of their own style. Bijapur, which I focus most of my examples on, it's really distinctive in the use of colors. So that very, very deep green with that bright orange and a pink and a lavender and the gold sky. That particular combination of colors, once you learn that, it's very easy to look at something and say, oh, that painting's from Bijapur, just because of the use of colors that it has.
Yeah. In fact, I was going to ask you that. Between Ahmednagar, Bijapur, Golconda, and Hyderabad, are there distinct styles? And then,
Yes.
of course, how do you differentiate them from Mughal?
Yeah, so Ahmednagar is a little bit difficult because really most of the paintings that survive date to between about 1550 and 1590. And they're these, they have a very distinctive style of kind of fine drawings of figures and either a blank background or a gold background in many of them. It's difficult to generalize. Bijapur, again, has a wide variety of styles, but again, that distinctive use of color and that distinctive kind of craggy mountains with that white castle, white palace in the background you see in many. Golconda, you have a heavier Persian influence in some of the paintings. And a lot of scenes of processions and darbars of the rulers, like wedding processions and things like that. Hyderabad, you do have more Mughal influence, but then you have this resurgence of a Deccan identity in the 18th century, where you see this influence, you see this interest in older Deccan manuscripts, like the Gulshani Ishq, that one that I showed you at the end, that is very popular in the 18th century that was written before the Mughals conquered the Deccan. And you also see this interest in older historical figures. So that painting of Chand Bibi that I showed you on horseback, she died trying to resist the Mughals. She becomes a very popular subject for paintings in 18th century Hyderabad. So you have some sort of thing that, and this period has been the least studied, because traditionally people thought, oh, it's a decline, but it's not a decline. We just haven't studied it enough. And so we don't quite know, but there seems to be some sort of historical memory that's happening that's looking back to these early Deccan sultanates. But stylistically, they've incorporated a lot from North India and from European prints. And so they're not exactly the same as the Mughals, but they're not exactly the same as the earlier Deccan sultanates either. That was a very long answer to say that absolutely we can tell difference between Mughal and Deccan painting, but it changes. What that difference is changes over time, I think.
Yes. So, Gauri, do we have time for one more
If
question?
you have one or two questions more, we can take it.
Yeah, there is another So Jiang Lee. I'll just read his question, him or her, I'm not sure, but it's fine. I'll read the question. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Could you elaborate further on the wall painting traditions of the Deccan as seen in the Asar Mahal paintings? Do these have a close connection with book art?
That's a great question. I wish I could answer that, but we only have about 3 wall paintings that survive in Bijapur. We have a few more that survive in Golconda, many in the Shia shrines, but these have been overpainted because they're still actively worshipped. So my immediate answer is yes, they absolutely do seem to have some sort of connection to the paintings, but we are missing so much of the information. Written descriptions of Noraspur, that city that Ibrahim founded, says that the buildings were covered in wall paintings. But that city was destroyed only about 25 years after its founding. And so none of those wall paintings survive. So what we have is a tiny, tiny percentage of what originally was made. But based on what survives, yes, they do seem to be connected to the book arts.
Thank you. I think, Gauri, that's it.
Yeah,
we
I
can
just
wrap
wanted
up.
to ask you one last question. I've forgotten his name, that Farooq, whoever, you said he's the same artist. He has painted through Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. I mean, his self-portrait was there in Shah Jahan's Mukharram or whatever you call it, no? How long did he live? I mean, I was just wondering.
Let me look at my, I don't have the dates of his life off the top of my memorized. Let me show you, let me just check. Oh dear, I don't have.
Farooq Beg is his name.
Farooq Beg, and he was born in, I think, around 1560, and he died in 1619, I believe.
Oh.
So,
Of course, I think Baburnama was illustrated much later than after it was written. But you said he had encounters with Akbar also. And then his self-portrait was there in Shah Jahan's Mukharram or whatever. So,
yeah, I don't know if it was painted during Shah Jahan's reign or if it was just put into that album later.
Oh.
Yael might know the answer to that question. But yes, he started painting in 1580 when he was a young man in Kabul. He then moves to Lahore or Delhi and works for Akbar. And so he paints, he contributes to the Akbarnama, which was made in sometime between 1595. He then goes to Bijapur for a decade, and then comes back in 1605 to work for Jahangir. And he stays working at the Mughal court for another 15-ish years until he dies. So yes, he is a remarkable artist in that he works for 3 different patrons.
and also for Deccan.
Yeah, and you see his style change remarkably.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it changes so much that that's why so many people don't believe he's the same person.
Yeah.
But we know that he disappears, that he's not in the Mughal court. And we know that this Farooq Hussain is only in Bijapur for that period. And some of the paintings that he made end up in albums for Jahangir. And so there's a lot of evidence that he might have brought back some of those paintings from the Deccan and given them to Jahangir. So there's a lot of evidence that does suggest he's the same person. We just have to kind of give up this expectation that artists will always have the same style.
It's just a natural evolution as they get better exposed over the years.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Thank you, Deborah. That was really very, very nice, very illuminating. And thank you, Vivek. I think we'll quickly move on to our next talk of the day.
Thank you, Deborah.
thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Lars.
Our second talk for the day is called Masters, Mentors and Disciples, The Lives of Mughal Painters, and is delivered by Dr. Yale Rice, Associate Professor at Amherst College, Massachusetts. The history of Mughal painting is often told through emperors, courts, and imperial patronage. I think we saw a bit of this in the second talk of third day, where we discussed Jahangir Nama, and we knew that most of the perspective was at least coming from the king's point of view. Unlike that, behind these celebrated works stood generations of artists whose creativity, skill, and ambition shaped the visual language of one of the world's greatest artistic traditions. Dr. Yale Rice, in her lecture, invites us to look at Mughal paintings through the lives and experiences of the artists themselves, and to consider their role in constructing and communicating imperial authority. Professor Yale Rice is Associate Professor of Art History and Asian Languages and Civilizations at Amherst College in Massachusetts. Earlier, she was the Assistant Curator of Indian and Himalayan Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Her research focuses on the art and architecture of South Asia, Central Asia, and Iran, with particular interest in manuscripts and portable arts produced between the 15th and 18th centuries. She is the author of the acclaimed book, The Brush of Insight, Artists and Agency at the Mughal Court, and co-editor of Readings on Painting from 75 Years of Mark. Professor Rice is especially recognized for placing artists themselves at the center of the story of Mughal art and for illuminating their creative agency within the imperial world. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Rice. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you happen to be in the world. I also want to thank Gauri for that generous introduction. And again, it's really a pleasure to be here, if virtually, with all of you. Let me share my screen. Okay, great. So this talk of about 60 minutes, I've titled Masters, Mentors, and Disciples, The Lives of Mughal Painters. I begin with you today with these two paintings. Perhaps some of you are familiar with them. Certainly the painting on the right is especially well known. But the work on the left, created around the 1590s, made for a manuscript of a history of Akbar, the Akbarname, depicts the Mughal Emperor Akbar here in the upper register of the page in a white jama or stitched coat, supervising the construction of the imperial city of Fatehpur Sikri, located not too far from Agra. And then the painting on the right shows Akbar's successor and his son, Emperor Jahangir, embracing his rival, Shah Abbas of Iran, the Shah or king of the Iranian Safavid Empire. While these works focus on their respective emperors, Akbar, Jahangir, in this talk, I really want to shift our attention to the makers of these paintings, and really to view the makers, the painters, through this lens of masters, mentors, and disciples. And more specifically, as you'll see as we come to the end of the talk, I want us to consider Mughal painters not merely as kind of craftsmen, craftspeople, but as the devoted innovators of a new manner of painting that elevated their patrons, in this case Akbar and Jahangir, to the status of prophet or Messiah-like saint kings. So to begin, I want to, and here just to flag again the particular framework that I will be employing in this talk. We have to first begin with the question of the formation of a Mughal imperial painting style. And in particular, the creation of a Mughal imperial style during the reign of Akbar. He rules from 1556 to 1605. And as some of you or many of you might know, he was the patron of a very, very large number of illustrated manuscripts, many of them featuring a very large number of paintings. And it's really here, it's really during his reign that we see a kind of Mughal painting style come fully into manifestation. Now, early Mughal painting, and I'm showing you just one example here. It's a page probably created around 1570 from a dispersed manuscript of the Hamza-name, which in English means the Book of Hamza. The Hamza-name essentially tells the kind of fantastical, adventurous stories of Hamza, who's a character based off of the paternal uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. And the illustration we see here actually doesn't feature Hamza. It shows a humble fisherman whom we see in the foreground, kind of wading into the waters, rescuing Hamza's son, Darab, who has been lost at sea. Okay, so, the Hamza-name has really been viewed as a kind of fulcrum for the creation of, again, this new imperial painting style, which many scholars have referred to as a synthesis, okay, a synthesis of styles, and more particularly a synthesis of painting artistic styles from Iran, from India, and to some extent also from Europe. Now, I should note here that the founders of the Mughal Imperial Painting Workshop, what is called the Kitabkhane, or literally the book house or library, were in fact Iranian. They were brought to India to work at the Mughal court. And in their capacity as directors and mentors, they trained and supervised the large number of painters who would eventually end up being employed in Akbar's Kitabkhane. Interestingly to note is that while the directors, the founders of this workshop, Mir Said Ali and Abdas Samad, were of Iranian origin, the majority of Akbar's painting workshop employed artists of more local extraction. So drawing from the Delhi-Agra region, eventually from the Deccan, also from Gujarat, from Rajasthan, from Bengal, and so on. So I just want you to think about that particular element as I walk us through a kind of rehearsal of this synthesis of styles using this page from this early manuscript of the Hamza-name. Okay, so as I mentioned, scholars have talked about this synthesis of style, again, originating in Akbar's workshop around 1560s, 70s, 80s, and that one of the key kind of ingredients of this new royal style of painting drew from Iran. And so I give you as an example an illustration from a very important royal manuscript, a copy of the poetic text, the Book of Kings, or the Shahnameh, composed by the poet Ferdowsi. This one made for a Safavid Shah Tahmasp. Okay, so that's that same empire and dynasty with whom Jahangir will be depicted later in that painting, right, with Shah Abbas, a successor to Shah Tahmasp. What I really want to draw your attention to here are some of the stylistic and formal similarities between the Hamzanameh page, which, by the way, is probably actually created in Lahore, in present-day Pakistan, and this page of about 45 years prior, created in Tabriz, Iran. Especially, might jump out to you are the very similar depictions of landscape, right? These kinds of kind of pink, purple, blue, and magenta craggy rocks that dot the horizon, as well as the foreground or ground line here, which we see echoes of in the Hamzanameh page in these kind of rocky formations as well. Another similarity that these two manuscript pages bear is the use of what we call a bird's eye perspective. And what I mean by that is the kind of spatial logic of the page. It's almost, perhaps we can call it a drone's eye view, right? We see this scene as if we're hovering above, just over it. So even though in the Safavid illustration on the left, the figure here of this ancient mythical king, he's actually larger, right, than the figures in the foreground, which really works against the rules of linear perspective, because the manner in which the artists, the painters, have depicted space as this kind of flattened overhead view, we nevertheless we comprehend the illustration as showing this figure here in the center as sitting in the distance, right? Beyond the smaller figure in the background. The Hamzanameh page, created at the Mughal court around 1570, similarly employs this kind of drone's eye or bird's eye view perspective, where we see the kind of land and space sort of tipped up, right? So that we can see more distantly into the background, and all distant space is portrayed in the upper register of the composition. A couple other things I want to point out that are reminiscent or parallels between the two pages include the artist's use of three-quarter perspective, which was really standard at the Iranian courts at this time. So what I mean is, right, the depiction of the face from this view rather than the strict profile view. We actually do see the strict profile view used in some instances in the Hamzanameh page, but note that the main characters, right, the fisherman, Darab here, are shown in that three-quarter view that we see here employed on the left in the Safavid manuscript illustration of 1525. So here we see, or we're starting to see, some of the Iranian ingredients of this new synthetic Mughal style, which of course would be attributable to the fact that the first directors of the Mughal workshop atelier came from Iran. And not only did they come from Iran, but they had in fact been employed in the Safavid Kiteb Khane. But many of you will have also picked up on the fact that we're seeing more local stylistic elements enter into the picture. So to draw your attention to this fact, I'm using this example of a page from a dispersed Bhagavata Purana manuscript, predating the Hamzaname page by perhaps a decade, and in fact created within the vicinity of the broader region, probably in the Delhi Agra area. It looks very different from the Hamzaname page to the extent that it employs the kind of landscape or horizontal framework versus the vertical or portrait layout of the Hamzaname page. It does not use bird's eye or drone's eye perspective. In fact, everything, the figures of Krishna, the gopis, and so on, kind of sit on the very surface of the pictorial field. However, I want to draw your attention to the manner of illustration or depiction of water here on the left, which really is echoed in the depiction of water in the Hamzaname page. One might think, well, that's just how one depicts water, but in fact, in the Iranian manuscript tradition, water was not depicted in this manner. And in fact, oftentimes artists used paints that included metallic substances like silver or even tin. Seldom did they actually depict water in, again, this very kind of Indic manner. I also want to point to the use of these yellows and greens here, right? These very kind of saturated, almost acidic yellows and greens in the Bhagavata Purana page, and then echoed here in the kind of fantastic depiction and detail of the trees, or this particular tree on the right-hand side in the Hamzaname page. And finally, I also want to point out another kind of subtle point of comparison, which is the use of red paint as a kind of red flag, if you will, to draw the viewer's eye to the key character or figure in the composition. In the example, the Bhagavata Purana page, of course, it is the figure of Krishna, who is depicted against this fantastic, rich, saturated red field. In the Hamzaname page, it is Hamza's own son, Darab, in the immediate foreground here in the lower register, who is wrapped in this kind of beautifully modeled, shadowed textile. So, of course, the use of red here is quite different, but I think practically speaking, they kind of serve a similar role here, right? To again indicate to the viewer, this is the main figure, right, in this narrative illustration. And again, we can explain these occurrences, right? This important Indic strain, right, thread in early Mughal painting by the fact that the majority of painters in Akbar's workshop were, again, relatively local, right, of South Asian origin. Finally, a third ingredient in the synthesis of style is a European one. This should not come as a total surprise. In fact, Akbar, as some of you will know, had welcomed a Jesuit mission of priests to his court. They remained in residence for a period of time. Of course, they had hopes that they would convert Akbar and his family to Catholicism. That would not happen, but Akbar nevertheless very much appreciated their company, and welcomed their gifts of printed books. We know, in fact, from archival historical evidence that Akbar was in receipt of one of these very important Jesuit illustrated printed books. In this case, an illustrated copy of The Life of Jesus that had been printed in Antwerp in 1595. I'm showing you a page of that here. We see in this illustration, which by the way has annotations so that the reader, who presumably is a kind of trainee, right, learning about the religion, could kind of decode what's going on in the composition. In this case, the composition being, of course, the nativity scene, right? The viewing of the baby Jesus in Bethlehem. And lo and behold, we actually have a surviving Mughal study of this very composition. I call it a study, not a kind of merely faithful mechanical copy. In the case of the illustration, the painting on the left, we see the Mughal painter really drawing from the original European engraving, but making many different, many adjustments to it, adding color to it. You may have already noted that the composition in the Mughal painting on the left is actually a reversal of the print. And that may have occurred, the reversal, because of the kind of means of transfer that the artist used, perhaps using tracing, etc., which would have resulted in the flipping, actually, of the composition. Where does the European element come into the picture in the Hamzaname? Well, I would suggest that it is most clearly apparent in the figure of the fisherman, Iskandar himself. Very, very unlike the depiction of the body in, say, the Bhagavata Purana or the Safavid Shahnameh. Here, the fisherman's body is fleshy, right? It's modeled, it bears shadow, right? The figure looks weight-bearing. Similarly, as I already referred to or described it, the textile that engulfs the baby infant Darab here is also heavily shadowed. So we get this sense of weight, right? Heft, and solidity, right? So we might then say this synthesis, if you will, draws on these three primary elements, although of course it's much more complicated than that. But it's one thing to say there's a synthesis, right? A synthesis of painting styles in evidence, but it's another thing to explain how such a synthesis even occurred, right? Who or what caused this synthesis of styles to happen? Was a synthesis even the goal? So there are a couple of answers or explanations that have been put forward to this question, right? How did this synthesis of styles occur? And one of these puts forward the figure of the emperor as the kind of progenitor, the source of Mughal painting or the Mughal painting style. And I show you here on the right-hand side a depiction of Emperor Akbar from a manuscript that we'll be looking a little more closely at shortly. And you see here on the left a map of South Asia. I'm just giving you a sense of the kind of borders, the geography of this empire. You know, artists working in Akbar's atelier drew from all corners of this very large empire. Okay, how is it that the emperor could be the source of a Mughal painting style? Where does this idea even come from? Well, it actually comes from the primary sources of the period. So we might turn to a very important text known as the Aini Akbari, a text composed in Persian. Its title can be translated as the Regulations of Akbar. It was authored by perhaps the closest companion of the emperor, known as Abul Fazl. He was also a historian, among other things. And in this text, the Aini Akbari, which Abul Fazl composes in the later 1590s, he writes, "His Majesty, from his earliest youth, has shown a great predilection for this art," and he means painting. And he gives it every encouragement as he looks upon it as a means both of study and amusement. Hence, the art flourishes, and many painters have obtained great reputation. Okay, so this is this one idea that of course, it's the patron who makes painting, but in particular, a new kind of Mughal painting style possible, right? And it's partly through his own particular predilection for painting and his encouragement, and no doubt, right, his bankrolling of this project. But these sources go a step further. So in the same text, again, the Aini Akbari, Abul Fazl actually describes, he has a whole section in this text where he talks about the Mughal Kitabkhane, the manuscript atelier. And he's talking about one of these Iranian artists who kind of founded Akbar's workshop. And Abul Fazl writes about this figure, Abd as-Samad. Though he had learnt the art before he was made a grandee of the court, his perfection was mainly due to the wonderful effect of a look of his majesty, which caused him, that is Abd as-Samad, the painter, to turn from that which is form to that which is spirit. So there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to draw out two key points. One is that Abul Fazl acknowledges that Abd as-Samad came to the Mughal court already trained. He had worked at the Iranian courts of the Safavid Shah. But here he, that is Abul Fazl, makes the point that nevertheless, it was really Akbar's presence, right? Even Akbar's glance that caused Abd as-Samad to become a true wonder, a true master, to the extent that Abd as-Samad sort of moved away from the superficial exterior, right, form, to interior essence or spirit. So if we take this all together, right, these passages from the Aini Akbari, among others, we could logically conclude that indeed Akbar must have been behind everything, right? He is the cause of Mughal painting, and he must have really, been the catalyst for the kind of synthesis of styles that we have just witnessed. However, I want to point out that this idea that Akbar is really the kind of enabler, right, of transformation and improvement is a trope. It occurs throughout this text of the Aini Akbari. In this text, Abul Fazl claims that Akbar also extended his penetrating foresight and introduced many wise methods to other offices and workshops at the court. That included the imperial kitchen, right? That he also improved the carpet manufactory, the perfumery, even the cattle stables, right? So I want to suggest that Akbar here, and he plays a very important role as patron, but the idea that he is making every decision behind every choice that painters make in his workshop, it is really a kind of rhetorical claim rather than a descriptive one. And it really means, in this case, on the part of Abul Fazl, to stress the role of Akbar as really the source of the wonderment of everything in the empire. However, that's simply not possible. Obviously, painters, perfumers, cooks also had a role in their own practices and their art. So if Akbar is not really, right, the source of this synthesis of styles, another explanation that we might turn to is what I call the master artist paradigm. And this draws on the idea that there was actually a limited number of what Abul Fazl in the Ain-i-Akbari describes as forerunners, right? The leaders, the masters of the Mughal imperial kitabkhane. He provides a list. How helpful. He provides a list of 17 forerunners. Note, by the way, the presence of Mir Said Ali Abdasamad as number 1 and number 2. Again, these are those artists who had immigrated to the Mughal court from Iran. But again, right, we should question or at least be critical of Abul Fazl's claims. We need to understand this text as a highly political and rhetorical text. And really to dispense with this idea that it is merely descriptive or objective. I want to suggest that it tells us something, though, perhaps, about attitudes, Mughal attitudes towards paintings and painters, and might even suggest clues about what, in fact, is a master or forerunner of painting. So I want to just briefly go through, not the whole list, but I want to show you some of the difficulties and the contradictions that emerge as we kind of dive into this list of 17 forerunners. Now, the majority of them, not all, but the majority on the list were actually pretty active in Akbar's workshop. The problem, though, as we see here, is that in many cases, at least to our very modern eyes, it could be difficult to differentiate one of the forerunners' hands from another. So I'm showing you here 3 details from a single manuscript created in the early 1580s at Akbar's court. It lives today in the British Library. And I've given you the artists who were responsible for the paintings. On the top, Jagana, who's number 11 on the list, Kemkaran, number 13 on the list, and Tara, number 14 on the list. Now, surely a connoisseur might have the capacity to understand or essentially decode the hand of each individual artist. But I want to suggest that maybe they're not so distinguishable from each other. Looking at these 3 artists' work here from that same artist raises this same manuscript raises the question of, what distinguishes them? Why are these artists forerunners? Also curious is the appearance of Mir Said Ali on this list of forerunners. Now, the Ain-i-Akbari was completed in 1596-97. Mir Said Ali actually left Akbar's atelier in 1569, so nearly 3 decades prior. He left in 1569 to perform the Hajj. So presumably he leaves to go on pilgrimage to Mecca, and there's no record that he ever returned to India. Abdasamad, number 2 on the list, and I'm showing you an example of one of his works dated 1588 here on the right. He also exited the Kitabkhane, not to leave India, but rather he was promoted. He was promoted to head the imperial mint in 1577. He apparently still executed the occasional painting, like the one we see here, but was otherwise not a kind of regular participant in the imperial workshop. We shouldn't underestimate his influence and his contributions. Again, he played an important role as one of the founders of the workshop, but he wasn't particularly or heavily active in Akbar's workshop in the 1590s. Rather, I want to suggest that his placement as number 2 on the list, also Mir Said Ali's placement as number 1 on the list, speaks more so to Abul Fazl's and Akbar's own kind of bias towards Iranian specialists. As some of you will know, the Mughals adopted Persian as their court language. They very much cultivated the immigration of Persian poets, artists, bureaucrats to their court. Numbers 1 and 2 might be, right, there also because they're Iranian. Now, when we go to number 4 on the list, Dasavanta, also attributed as a forerunner, a master. What's interesting about his role here, and I'm showing you a painting from the Hamzaname manuscript that has been attributed to Dasavanta. What's interesting about him is, according to Ain Akbari, or the Ain Akbari, he actually committed suicide around 1584, but nevertheless continued to obtain the status of a forerunner, at least in Abul Fazl's calculations. Basavana, number 3 on the list. He was a very active member of the atelier, but his roles in various manuscript projects varied. So we do have limited numbers of paintings, manuscript illustrations like this one, again, from that Darab Name manuscript in the British Library, that are attributed to Basavana's hand. And by that, I mean the notion, the idea is that he alone executed the painting, invented the design, and then colored it in. However, the vast majority of works associated with Basavana's hand are ones where he played the role of designer rather than colorist. So in this painting that we see here from a copy of the Akbarname, a history of Akbar's reign, also composed by Abul Fazl. And we see, by the way, here Akbar at the top, surrounded by a sort of 2 rival battling groups of yogis. He, in this case, Basavana was responsible really for the invention of the design, essentially the kind of underlying architecture, the layout of the page, right? That he would have sketched onto the paper, whereas another artist, in this case, an artist called Tara Kalan, or Tara the Elder, actually did all the work of filling in the design. So he actually painted it. So again, just to sum up what I just said, in most of Basavana's work, number 3, again on this list of Abul Fazl's forerunners, Basavana, in fact, created the layout that a painter then filled in after. This raises questions, at least for me, about what are these forerunners, right? What is a forerunner in Abul Fazl's calculation, right? Does it merely mean someone who's just really skilled as an artist? What about the case of Basavana, right? Where most of the surviving manuscript illustrations attributed to him are cases where he created the design and someone else colored it in. What if Abul Fazl's forerunners are forerunners because they were collaborators, or because they were, right, mentors to colorists? So with that, I want to shift gears a little bit away from Abul Fazl's list of forerunners to look at the kind of prodigious production of illustrated manuscripts at Akbar's court between the 1560s and 1598. This list that we see here is incomplete. I haven't included every single manuscript, illustrated manuscript patronized by Akbar, really just the big ones. And what I really want to draw your attention to are, well, one, the list of surviving number of paintings. Many of these manuscripts are fragmentary, but we're actually able to estimate how many paintings in these manuscripts would have originally existed. So the Hamzaname page manuscript, only 200 illustrated pages survive, thereabouts. But we have reason to believe that there were around 1,400 paintings originally created. Obviously, many of them no longer surviving. Just going down this list, you see another manuscript, 118 illustrations. The Darabname, 200 illustrations. A Baburname, that is a history or memoirs of Babur, 193 illustrations. So this is a large atelier, and they're extremely, extremely active, right? Not only that, but we know that especially in these cases, this history of the family of Timur, the so-called Book of War, which is a Persian translation of the Mahabharata, a Persian translation of the Ramayana, so on and so forth, especially in these texts, that these are the ones that really have the largest number of illustrations. We know that the majority of these illustrations were made by 2 or more artists, right? 2 or more artists, just like Basavana was accustomed to working. But how did these artists work together, right? If collaboration was the norm, how did that work? You might be wondering, well, how do we even know the number of artists who were employed in a single manuscript project? For example, the Akbarname, a history of Akbar, created in the 1590s. We have dozens of artists who were employed illustrating this single manuscript, which, by the way, today is fragmentary. We don't have the whole thing anymore. How we know these artists' names is thanks to Persian inscriptions in red ink that appear in the lower margins. So I draw your attention here, right? And these tell us not only the names of the painters who worked on the illustration, but also the particular capacity in which they worked. So we learn from these inscriptions, which, by the way, are not signatures. They were most likely added by perhaps a project manager. We learn from the inscription that the artist Tulsi was responsible for the design, right? Really the invention of the pictorial narrative, the layout, what's known in Arabic as tar. We learn too that an artist known as Bandi was responsible for the amal, or work, again, from Arabic. And this really refers to, again, the coloring, the filling in of the page. What we might today really think of as, you know, what makes a painting a painting. And we also get some additional information that the portraits, and here not everyone's portrait, but the portraits of esteemed individuals, these were created by an artist known as Madhav Ford, or Madhav the Younger. And you might guess whose esteemed portrait was depicted here. None other than, of course, Akbar. Again, we see him in his white jama. And if you look closely, you might note that his face, the manner of its depiction, is in fact quite different from some of the other faces here in the composition. This figure is probably Abul Fazl, right? And his face or portrait was probably also executed by Mughal. So this is how we are able, in fact, to create lists of dozens of painters who apparently were responsible for illustrating these heavily pictorialized manuscripts during the 1580s and 1590s. Now, I want to kind of walk us through an exercise of looking at one double page illustration. This comes from that same Akbarname manuscript in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And it depicts a battle that occurred in Gujarat a couple decades prior, a victorious battle, by the way, victorious for Akbar. We see Akbar here on the right-hand side, right? And his opponents here on the left. So I want to look closely at these pages because the information that artists collaborated, right? Designer, colorist, essentially. It's informative, but we still need to understand, well, what is it actually that each of them did, right? Where does the designer's work end and the colorist's work begin? So I like this particular double page example because the same artist, known as Lal, was responsible for the tar or design in both pages, okay? Right, the layout. But two different artists colored each side. So on the right, an artist who is identified as, in the inscription in red in the lower margin, as Babu Nakash was the colorist, and on the left, an artist known as Sanvale was the colorist. Okay. Oops. Okay. And there you see actually the transliteration. I've given you transliteration and translation of those inscriptions in the lower margins. And so the reason I like to look at these two pages is that we know it's the same designer, but now we can kind of compare what one colorist does compared to the other. So just kind of focusing in on these shrubs on the two pages, if we blow them up, we can see very, very clearly how the designer Lal's hand, right, is visible in both, right? The same kind of form, architecture, layout, right? Essentially the outlines of the plants. But then we can also see how Babu Nakash on the right, Sanvale on the left, approached their own missions of coloring, right? Two quite different outcomes. The example on the left, to my eye, seems a little less finished, right? The example on the right, a bit more. If we zoom back out and back in, we see differences here too. Again, look at the kind of unfinished look of the shrubs on the left versus on the right, almost as if Sanvale didn't have the time to outline or complete his work. But these differences also apply to the depiction of the horses, the armor, right? The costume. Note the extra special attention that Babu Nakash, the colorist, gave to depicting pattern, color, versus what we see here on the left. It's just a much more kind of scaled back palette, right? Much less detail. So what is going on here? We might surmise that Sanvalet, the colorist of the work on the left, was just a less skilled painter. However, I've looked at his work as colorist throughout this manuscript, and I know from that he had, in fact, the ability, the capacity to do the kind of coloring work that Babu Naqash did. So what is going on? Well, I suggest that the main difference here is that the painting on the right includes an image of Akbar. Before I get to that detail, and that it's the fact that Akbar is depicted in the right-hand page that very likely resulted in perhaps a directive to the colorist to give more attention, time, materials, paint, gold to that page, right? The page on the left shows the enemy. You don't have to give as much time, labor, right? Paint to their depiction. Let's concentrate, right? Really highlight the right-hand page, the imperial portrait page. Not only that, though, as we move in closer to the right-hand page, we start to see that Akbar's face, his portrait, the hand of the painter is very different from that seen in the other faces in the composition. And I hope all of you can see that. Note, for example, the very kind of sinuous line, the very fine line of Akbar's eyebrow, right? Even his mustache, compared with the mustaches and eyebrows of the figures on the right-hand side. I don't think this is a case where it's the same artist, but he just spent more time on the figure of Akbar. I actually believe, and this is through close examination of many illustrated pages in this manuscript, that in fact, it's Lal's hand we see in this depiction of Akbar, that here Lal came into the page, the painting, at the end of the project. After Babu Naqash had kind of filled all the color, he did the lion's share of the work, right? The painting. But Lal came in and repainted and adjusted Akbar's face. And in fact, we can even see some disturbance of the paint right around the profile of Akbar to indicate, right, that there has been some repainting. Now, I've found this to be the case across the Akbar-Name manuscript. Here is another illustrated page from an earlier episode in this fragmentary manuscript, where again, we see evidence of repainting, right? And also significant differences in painting manner when we look at Akbar's profile versus the other figures' profiles. What in fact is going on here? Well, I believe that it was the designers who came in at the end, right? Probably supervised the colorist's work and then made adjustments to the faces, to portrayals of Akbar throughout this manuscript, because he's portrayed many times. Probably to ensure that, you know, there's a kind of consistent representation. He's recognizable. Because if you have 60, 70 artists painting, coloring, designing the illustration in this manuscript, right, you're going to have innumerable variations on the appearance of Akbar. Better that the designer come in and fix, right, canonize the representation of Akbar here. This tells us then that this partnership of colorist and designer was not simply, you know, a situation where the designer just handed off the painting, but rather a back and forth. I want to even suggest that the designer perhaps function in the capacity as a kind of mentor, right? Overseer of the colorist's work, making, again, adjustments as needed. Now, I want to turn to a graph because when we take the surviving illustrated pages from this fragmentary manuscript, when we account for all the ascriptions to various artists in those notations in the lower margins in red ink, and then we create a graph simply showing the incidence of artist names, this is what we find. And here you can see the very large number of artist names that appear in these ascriptions, but I want to draw your attention to the slope of this graph. That in fact, we have a small number of artists who are very, very, very active. You know, their names are represented many, many times in the inscriptions. And then a whole host of artists whose names appear once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times. These kind of lesser occurring artists are the colorists. The more active or more frequently occurring names are the designers. And I'll unpack that a little further momentarily. What's fascinating to me is that if we map out the incidence of artist ascriptions in multiple manuscripts, this includes an imperial copy of the Razamname held in Jaipur, a copy of the history of the family of Timur held in the Khorabakhsh library in Patna, and then a copy of the Ramayana also held in Jaipur. We see a similarly sloping graph, right? Which suggests that this was not a one-off. In fact, the organization of project teams, right? Artists, groups of artists working together on a single manuscript was very deliberate. It was calculated to the extent that even in cases like this manuscript that was illustrated in 1585 with far fewer illustrations, I think around 34 illustrations, even in that case, the graph is similarly sloping. So it didn't even have to do with the fact that the manuscript is heavily, heavily illustrated. Okay. I think I'm going to go a little bit over, so I'm going to actually kind of work through the final points of some of these graphs I want to show you. I think I'll probably just conclude there, so I won't necessarily get to the disciple role, but I'm very happy to, discuss questions about that. This material is just so interesting, I can talk about it for a very long time. Another kind of graph that I want to show you, actually what it depicts, what it calculates is these collaborations between designers and colorists. So here, this network graph actually shows betweenness and centrality. What is betweenness centrality? It's a statistical measure that indicates the centrality of a node, and that is each of these circles in which we see an artist's name ascribed. The centrality of a single node within a network. And it doesn't simply calculate the sort of number of times, right, a single artist's name occurs, but actually calculates the number of the shortest paths from all vertices or edges, okay? So each of these indicates a point or instance of collaboration. Thicker lines or edges indicate a larger number of collaborations. So it indicates actually how a node essentially functions as a bridge to other nodes, okay? Ultimately, what this tells us is that The nodes that are very large and more saturated with color had high betweenness centrality and thus a higher degree of influence on the transfer of knowledge practice to other, mainly colorists. I can get into this more perhaps in the Q&A. So in short, this network graph that I've created of artists active in illustrating the Victorian Akbarname of 1590-95 shows that, again, like we saw with the bar graph, there was a very small number of artists who have a great degree of influence. Here, one figure that especially stands out is Miskina. Unsurprisingly, Lal as well. And then Basavan, right? Not surprising at all. But I also want you to take note of the fact that many of these artists, again, these high influencers, worked a single time or 2 or 3 times with colorists, right? And these colorists didn't necessarily work with any other designer. Remarkably, we see a similar pattern emerge when we graph a network of betweenness centrality in other manuscripts. These made in the 1580s, the Jaipur Razamname, again, Lal, Basavana, Dasavanta. They're mainly active in these cases. They have a high degree of influence in their roles as designers. And as I conjecture, also kind of mentors, the colorists. The Jaipur Ramayana, similar pattern. These are going to become familiar names to you, right? Lal, Basavana, and so on. Jagana, one of our forerunners on Abul Fazl's list. And finally, in the Khudabakhsh Tarikh-e Khandani Timuriya, lo and behold, there's Lal, there's Basavana. These, again, are highly influential figures within this statistically calculated network graph, showing their kind of function as bridges, right, of influence among other painters. Okay, well, what does all of this mean? I want to offer 2 key takeaways. One is that across the multiple manuscript projects of, I don't know how that happened, the 1580s and 1590s, there were a small number of artists who served as designers within a given project, and that these designers worked with multiple colorists, granting these designers a high degree of influence, right? They get to work with a lot of people, but the colorists, most of them only work with 1, maybe 2 designers, right? And it's these artists, these large, more saturated nodes in the network graphs, who are really the purveyors of knowledge and practice, right? They possess high betweenness centrality. Another key takeaway is that when we consider which colorists the designers worked with across multiple manuscript projects, we actually find, to my surprise, that collaborators seldom worked together multiple times. Now, I had hypothesized that before I made these graphs, I imagined that artists who were related, many, we know in fact that, fathers and sons, uncles and nephews, brothers were employed in Akbar's Kitabkhane. I imagined that these individuals would work together, right, across multiple projects by virtue of their familial relationship. Well, when you actually map out patterns of collaboration, we find that even in cases where a designer and colorist might work together 3 times in one manuscript, establishing a relationship of collaboration in subsequent projects where both of them are employed, the likelihood is they will not work together again. What do we make of this? Well, I draw on the work of sociologist Mark Granovetter, who published a very important article in 1973 called The Strength of Weak Ties. Nothing to do with artists, nothing to do with the Mughal Empire, But his argument, which is very compelling, is this, that if one wants to achieve greatest degrees of influence, right? Let's say you're on the job market, you're looking for a job. You don't want to rely on your closest ties, right? Your best friend, your uncle. It's much better to extend and proliferate weaker ties, that is, connections with acquaintances, people you don't know very well. Your sort of map and network of influence will be far greater. And something interesting is happening in the Mughal atelier that's very similar, to the extent that artists here are reproducing this model of weak ties, where Vasavana in one project works with 8 artists, the next project he works with another 15 artists, never working with the same artist twice. I conjecture that this, like the very shape of those bar graphs that I showed you a moment ago, was also intentional, devised probably by a project manager, the workshop director, and the goal was to disperse individual influence of those forerunners, right? Those key designers across the workshop. We're talking about a workshop that employed over 100 painters. And if the goal was to produce a synthetic, consistent, canonized imperial Mughal painting style, this was really the best way to do it, especially with a workshop of that size. So to conclude, Abul Fazl's list of forerunners, it may not be wrong per se, but it actually might tell us something unexpected. It may not actually be the list of the best artists, right? Or, you know, the most sort of genius artists. They were surely experienced, highly trained. But I think part of the reason they became forerunners and masters here also had to do with their roles as master mentors and pedagogues, right? That they had to function in a bureaucratic capacity, right? Overseeing the work of many colorists, correcting it, working together, creating in a way a community of practice rather than just a list of 17 masters, right? We're talking really about style based on a workshop, right? A style that doesn't originate simply in the master patron or in a small group of master artists, but rather materializes, comes into being through the deliberate configuration of project teams of many, many artists, and a system of practice that ensured that these numerous artists, drawn from many different painting workshops across South Asia, that they could be trained to inculcate, right, a single consistent imperial painting style. So I'll conclude with that because it's 10:42 my time. I think I'm a little bit over, and I want to be able to take some questions. But this is really what I mean by looking at the Mughal painting through a kind of master and mentor framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. I think you have thrown us all into a spin. You have told us so much, but most important of all, we have always wondered how these guilds worked, because these guilds or studios, whatever you want to call them, because this is not just restricted to Mughal paintings. If you see the Pallava sculptures, Chola sculptures, Obviously, there was a group working on it. How did they consistently manage to come up with a particular style, a particular standard quality? Like, so this is a real
Exactly.
eye-opener for us to understand that there was a master designer who was also a bureaucrat and an influencer who probably spread and his ideas and controlled the whole regime. So this is one way of not only producing prolific art, but prolific art of a certain quality, which never goes down overall, like, you know. So
That's
that
right.
is really,
That's right.
yeah. So this is
I'm sorry I
really,
didn't get to the rest
Yeah.
of the talk. There's so much more I obviously overplanned. But I think as a whole, this tells us, as you said, so much about how workshops in
work.
general function, right? And I think it's familiar to any of us who have known or know that it isn't only genius that leads to success. You
Yeah.
need to be able to actually work with people.
I mean, to a great extent, it translates to modern team leadership in a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
It's like the corporate paradigm.
Yeah, where you ensure both delivery and delivery of a certain quality. And
Exactly.
and that whole thing about the left page being not being so detailed out the right, that all reflects to that you prioritize where the best quality needs to be projected. And doesn't matter if the sum of it is slightly compromised, as long as the overall level remains the same or projects the same
Exactly.
identity. Yeah. So
Exactly.
that is really an eye-opener. I now invite Vivek to take over the question answer section. Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Rice, thank you so much for this exhaustive presentation. The first question is, how did you go about doing this?
Mhm.
All the graphs that you made and the comparisons, how were
Thanks
you?
so much. Yeah. Thanks so much for asking that question, because that itself was a trial. I am myself not trained as a statistician. I had no idea how to create network graphs. The seeds of the idea were really planted when I was a graduate student. My PhD advisor actually showed me a network graph of a, she had actually worked for the Aga Khan Foundation. She had a
Okay.
student create a network graph of the various employees of this foundation. And she found it really interesting, as did I, because it started to show sort of the map of influence, right? Who are the key nodes? And I was struck by this idea, like, wait, we have all this data about painters, right? Not the, I mean, of course we have the primary source text of the Ain Akbari, among other historical sources, but in talking about those ascriptions, right? That tell us this individual created the design, this individual did the coloring, and we have hundreds and hundreds of these, and it's quite unique. I know of no other manuscript tradition where we have this kind of surfeit of such data. And I was like, well, gosh, if I could simply map all of this out, create a network graph like this. My hypothesis originally was that what we would see is that clusters of artists who were familially connected, fathers, sons, uncles, nephews, brothers, and so on, that they would form little clusters. We might see some regional connections, because we know from the names of artists, like, a name like Ibrahim Kashmiri, right? Kashmiri artist, or so-and-so Gujarati, that we would start to see these clusters of individuals who work together, because that kind of made sense to me, right? You work with your family members, you work with your countrymen. I proved myself wrong, but it took a while to do that because I had no idea how to do that kind of work. And it took actually several years. I managed to, I applied for membership or to participate in a workshop at the University of California, Los Angeles. I was funded by the Getty Foundation, that was meant to train art historians in digital methods. And it was through that I started to really do the work, and I learned about how to structure data. I learned how to clean data, and then I had to learn how to use a not very user-friendly open source network graphing program that I then was able to, you can create a network graph based on centrality, betweenness centrality, all kinds of statistical measures. And it was through that I realized, I was like, oh, I was wrong. Surprisingly, in fact, family members don't work together. Individuals who might work 3 or 4 times in a given project never work together again. And I had to make sense of that. And I started to dig into some of the sociological scholarship about betweenness centrality and networks, and really work that has, of course, nothing to do with anything I study or write about, but is, you know, sociological analysis. And so I'll be honest with you that it took me a few years to actually gain the skills, the knowledge, to know how to do this. This is not something that was taught in my graduate program at University of Pennsylvania. It wasn't, it's not part of any curriculum, or maybe some now. But I have taken it upon myself to integrate some of these methods into courses I teach to undergraduates.
Okay.
And I have worked with graduate students, not at my own institution, because I only work with undergraduates at my college, to essentially mentor and train others to use these methods. I don't think these kinds of statistical digital methods, I don't think we can use them alone, right?
Okay.
You pair them with the close looking, right? And the close critical attention to the historical sources. So I see them as, I see it as simply one tool in the toolkit.
And coming to the paintings themselves,
Yeah.
today we are able to create copies, or let's say we attempt multiple paintings, but something where so many people worked. So do you think they had the time or the space to actually create something and then actually do the final painting, or was it that they would have worked at one shot and completed it?
I'm not sure I completely understand.
Did
What
they
I
make rough draft? Sorry.
Yeah, rough drafts,
Did they
yes.
have rough drafts and things?
Yeah.
You said, I mean, you did say about Akbar's face saloon or the important parts getting repainted, but did they also have rough drafts of the whole composition, etc., where they tried out and then they moved here like that? I think that's what you mean, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
If they did, if there were initial sketches, those do not survive, at least
Yes.
in the case of the manuscripts that I've been talking about. I've long been really interested in what this design, right, the tar actually comprises. Actually, interestingly, tar is a word from Arabic that's also applied to an architectural ground plan.
Okay.
Right? It's the ground plan, right?
Yes.
I've been interested to see, you know, how sort of developed was that, right? Did these lead designers, you know, was it a kind of hard line?
Yeah.
Like how
Yes.
much latitude does the colorist have to kind of paint outside the lines?
Yeah.
My close examination of a number of these collaboratively made paintings suggests that the tar, the design was more like a suggestive sketch.
Okay.
Usually executed in a kind of gray transparent ink, right? That could be easily covered up with opaque watercolor. And that means then that, you know, the colorist didn't always follow the kind of pictorial guidelines of the designer. It also means that the colorist also had so much latitude in how he filled in those compositional cells, right? As we saw with the comparison of the 2 pages from the Akbarname, we saw in one case, the colorist fills in lots of detail. There's a whole repertoire of pattern, right? Pattern designs that the colorist had to deploy, right? In a creative and, you know, I don't know.
His own artistic inclinations come through quite clearly, like.
Yeah. So to your question, I think the process is really one that the process of actually developing the illustration is occurring on that single surface of the page,
Okay.
right? So rather than working out all the ideas through sketches and, as far as I know, we don't have the evidence for it, but I hypothesize. I think it was really, that was all kind of happening on the page itself. So we can even think of these manuscripts as they're not only the evidence of the working out of an imperial style, they're the very material where this is happening.
Okay.
Right. And you could then go back in and, bear in mind that the very last thing, or one of the last stages in the process of creating a manuscript is the stitching together
Yes.
the bifolios, right? So until that happens, we're simply talking about loose leaves of paper, right? So none of this even has to be happening, none of this being the design, the coloring, in a single location,
Oh.
right?
Yeah.
So you might even have clusters of, Basavana and his colorists, Lal and his colorists. They might
Yes.
be working in
Yeah,
clusters.
I was just going to ask you, did they have multiple ateliers?
We have simply a dearth of clear evidence as to what the Kitabkhane even looked like. Was it a single space? There have been various hypotheses about where at Fatehpur Sikri, for example, the atelier may have been located. I believe there was probably a kind of central clearinghouse, but by necessity, I don't think it was again necessary for every single individual to be stationed in one location. Now you did need access to materials, right? This is really, really important. Someone, and I don't necessarily think it's the colorist, but maybe it was the colorist, someone has to mix all the paints, and this has to be done regularly. And you also don't want, a great degree of inconsistency. So, one guy makes blue this way, another guy makes blue that way, right? So there has to be some kind of central clearinghouse. But then the actual labor, and this is something I didn't take note of in the talk, we actually have workshop directives that survive in the margins of those Akbarname pages. John Seiler has studied those extensively and published his work on that, fascinating work. That indicate, these are workshop directives that indicate the number of days in which an illustration is to be completed.
Oh.
And can you imagine how many days was budgeted? And this all comes down to budget, right? Time is money. Okay. So listen, that page on the left-hand side that doesn't have Akbar in it, take 40 days.
40
But the
days.
other side, so yeah, we have evidence from that manuscript that some of those illustrations, of course, the ones that bear depictions of Akbar, some of the ones that are most detailed, most sort of richly colored, took up to 60 days.
And what was the size?
Days. I'm sorry?
What was the size? Size?
Oh, of the illustrated page?
Hmm.
I want to say I have them on a slide. I could give it to you in centimeters, but about like that. The Hamza Name pages are a whole other story. They're about, sorry to use imperial measurement, but about 2 feet tall, so about 60 centimeters in height. So we're talking about, in some cases, oversized monumental manuscripts. In the case of the Jaipur Ramayana, the Jaipur Razamname, also quite large. So maybe up to, I don't want to throw out a number, but at least maybe over 30 centimeters in height.
Okay.
So quite large and fully colored in many cases.
So thank you, Dr. Rice. We have a question from one of our participants. One moment. Yeah. I just read the question. A forerunner may well have been one of it that is closer to the text, the language of the code, his perceived sensitivity to the subject, rather than just artistic or technical skills. And we also have a question from our previous speaker, Dr. Deborah. I'll read it out. Yale, wonderful. I'm envious of the info you have on Mughal artists. Question: do you know, does this collaborative structure continue under subsequent emperors, or is it just unique
Yeah.
to Akbar's reign?
Great question. Thanks, Deborah, for that. And I'll say just first off, it is so unique, and I want to take full advantage of the kind of volume of data we have. I wish we had that body of data for, manuscript workshops in the Deccan and other places too. Although I'm sure perhaps you and some of the viewers are also familiar with the work of B.N. Goswami on Pahari painters, where he drew from archival material to essentially construct a very different kind of network of artists. So I think it's possible, though, with different data sets. So under Jahangir, right, who succeeds Akbar in 1605, the imperial manuscript atelier is reduced in size from over 100 painters to maybe a couple dozen. And various theories that have been put forward as to why that took place. Why was there this kind of shift? And I won't really go into that territory, but as a result, it isn't so much that there was a reduced interest in manuscript painting. What we see instead is far fewer of these heavily illustrated manuscripts, right? A manuscript with 200 illustrations or 180 illustrations. Instead, we see manuscripts that have a smaller number of illustrations, but each illustration being, created oftentimes by a single artist. Okay. So they become, in a way, more about the kind of performance of expertise of single artists. And they might take, 60, 80 days. It's hard to know because the incidence of these ascriptions in the lower margins of the manuscripts also, right, is reduced at this point. So we just have less of that data. So that, again, this shift towards manuscripts that have fewer, but, heavily, laboriously painted illustrations by a small number of painters. What I would have gotten into the talk had I maybe spent less time on the earlier part of it is that under Jahangir, right, we have a smaller number of artists that cease to function simply as pedagogues, mentors, bureaucrats. They actually become inculcated in the emperor's cult of discipleship, which is kind of extraordinary. And this is something I talk about, of course, in my book, where we have the smaller number of artists, and they possess this kind of intimate connection with the emperor Jahangir in a way that Akbar, did not inculcate as much.
Yeah, I mean, this was somewhat highlighted in the second talk on day 3. You happen to watch it.
Oh, good. So
yeah,
I didn't even have to go into
No,
that.
she did talk about Jahangir Nama and how Jahangir's own perception was really reflected there, and the artist was very close to him. He traveled everywhere with him and things like that, and a slightly larger than life projection of Jahangir all the time, like as though he's his search and what he wanted. The themes themselves were more about Jahangir than about everything else that was happening around him.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. And of course, the European influences were more and things like that also. Definitely even much more than in Akbar's time. I think
even
the other question that Vivek asked, I'll just repeat it again, that is it also possible that the forerunner was one who was probably closer to the text and the language of the court, and hence so able to understand what needs to be visually depicted than necessarily a skillful artist, like I don't know. I mean, maybe even in terms of sculpture, like if you take a temple sculpture team and all,
Yeah.
The head sculptor may not be a great sculptor, but has a much clearer idea of what needs to be put where and in what size and proportion. So he kind of controls the whole thing. And then the individual sculptors may probably be better sculptors, but they are restricted to their areas or something like that.
That's right.
That's also possible, Mike.
I think it's a really, really excellent question. I can only conjecture. We don't actually know what their linguistic capacities were. I suspect that certainly some of them were literate in Persian. Certainly the project managers, the inscriptions, the workshop notes, they're all in Persian. Persian is the lingua franca of the court. Whether it was the case that the designers were actively reading the text and devising their designs based on their interpretation of the text isn't wholly clear. It could have been the case that what I call a kind of project manager, and this sounds very kind of corporate speak today, there may have been one or two of those who were, in fact, the very literate ones who were kind of, maybe scheming, working with the other designers to come up with ideas. What's really, really fascinating about this Akbarname manuscript, the fragmentary manuscript in the V&A in London, it's not the only illustrated Akbarname manuscript, but we believe it to be the earliest, and we believe it to be the imperial copy probably made for Akbar. And what's really, really interesting about it, many, many things, but there is clear evidence that that manuscript was actually partially being edited as it was being made. We know that Abul Fazl's process of composing this amazing text, right? How he goes about it is extraordinary. He interviews everyone at the court. He's talking to family members. I mean, he really wants to do a thorough job, but he has to, like any text, any monumental text, has to go through multiple stages of editing. So what this means is that those illustrations are being made in the process of the text being edited. And I think this is really significant because it suggests a degree of influence and agency on the part of the painters, right? That, the author, the textual experts are kind of working in tandem with the pictorial ones. Not to mention, it also speaks to a perception of the time that paintings were fundamentally important to the writing and composition of chronicles, right? Because they couldn't dispense with them.
One interesting aside that I noticed, I mean, I could be wrong also, none of the colorists graduated to become forerunners. So it's not like you started at the bottom as an intern and came up or something like that, You kind of remained in that setup, and that's
it's interesting. Such a great question. We do have instances where if you kind of trace from the earlier manuscripts that their artist descriptions say from the early 1580s, like the Darabname, up to the later 16th century, you do see where select artists start
becoming forerunners. That's
appear a little more frequently. However, and this isn't going to surprise anyone at all, but to become a sort of, whether a forerunner or one whose name appears more frequently, someone who's more active in the production of manuscript illustrations, it helped if your dad or your brother or your uncle worked in the atelier. So in a way, we have kind of Nipo artists, if you will, right? It always, it's the same story. It helps if you have connections.
And I just want to conclude that the Mughals were patrons of art. They encourage art very well. They also did a lot of buildings. And I wish somebody would have done a study of how they built these buildings in the same way that you have broken down this art, how they did it. And then we would understand that, we will be able to understand how they managed these two monumental things. Art is also important, craft was important, and the buildings were also important.
If the
And,
concept of guilds or atelais moved on to their buildings also.
yes,
No?
yes.
Fully agree with you. And I believe actually the method that I have put forward here, which I think is a pretty simple, straightforward one, I imagine it could actually be applied to any number of workshops at
Yes.
the court, not to mention the army.
Yeah,
as well.
yes.
Because again, to bring us into the contemporary moment, this is, I actually worked with a friend who's a health economist. He's the one who helped me to interpret the graphs. And he was like, this is a corporate structure, right?
Yes.
This is how you build effective corporations
Yes.
and, teams of specialists. So I don't think, I imagine it wasn't unique to the painting workshop. The problem, our challenge is that what is the data? What is your data set, right? In my case, it's these inscriptions. What is your data set for architecture? We do have Mason marks on select monuments.
Yes.
And there are studies of those, not necessarily of the kind using the methods that I've employed. But I think there's promise there, right? Because surely they were employing a similar kind of model, probably, that you would be familiar with, on a building site,
Yes.
right?
Yes. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Rice. It was
Thank
a
you so much.
pleasure listening to you and looking forward to more association.
Yeah.
Gauri.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. As we come to the end of today, I would like to thank both our speakers, Dr. Deborah Hutton and Dr. Yale Rice, for bringing such fresh new perspective and giving us so many new ideas about the themes. And thanks to Vivek for moderating. Just before I conclude, see. Tomorrow we move on and we move to what we call living traditions beyond the courts, where we look at surviving practicing traditions as they continue to flourish amongst living communities of India. And I hope all of you will log in for the final 2 lectures tomorrow. From Tamil Heritage Trust, thank you to all our audience and good night.